Throughout its history, the British Isles have always been a land of many languages and many cultures, some older than others. With a presence in the Isles that extends far into the mists of prehistory, the Celtic Britons predate the mounted Norman knights of Duke William, the Saxon feuds of Alfred the Great heathen army of Ivar the Boneless, and the legions of Emperor Claudius. As this litany of conquerors might suggest, the Celtic Britons have spent much of their history in a steady retreat. However, there is so much more to their history than sorrow and loss. In this special long-form documentary, we will do justice to the fascinating society and history of the Celtic peoples of Britain, covering everything from their earliest origins to the wars with Rome, to the departure of the Empire, to the coming of the Anglo-Saxons, and the mythical age of Arthur. Consider liking, sharing, commenting and subscribing. It helps immensely. Even better, help us out by playing the sponsor of this video, Rise of Kingdoms. Rise of Kingdoms is an epic cross-platform strategy game that takes players on an immersive journey through various historical eras. In ROK, you can choose from 14 historical civilizations that have truly existed, including the newest one, Greece. Famous generals and unique military units from different civilizations will obey your every command as you build your own legends on the battlefield. The Greece civilization, featuring exclusive commanders and special units, Argiraspides, will add a new level of excitement to the game. To celebrate Greece joining the battlefield, the Civilization Clash event will be held, allowing players to compete for their own civilizations. There's tons of other exciting features for you to find in ROK, including seamless world maps, customizable architecture, and so on. Download Rise of Kingdoms now by clicking the first link in the description or pinned comment, or scanning the QR code. Participate in the new event by clicking the second link in the description, rok.games, with a chance to win prizes including Apple Vision Pros, PS5s and Switch OLEDs. Also, for new players, make sure to redeem the promo code GREECE4ROK for 20 silver keys. The code will only be available within the first 3 days. Now, back to the video. In the modern day, the Celtic languages and cultures of Britain are highly marginalised. The insular Celtic tongues, once the predominant forms of speech across the entire British Isles, today survive in daily use only on its extreme westernmost fringes. Irish and Welsh are faring the best, with a relatively healthy population of speakers in the hundreds of thousands, but the fates of Scottish Gaelic, Cornish and Manx are fraught with far more doubt. Breton, a Celtic language brought to France's northwestern peninsula by British migrants in the early Middle Ages, also faces a bleak future. However, modernity has brought about a renewed interest in Celtic identity. Today, Celtic heritage is a point of pride for people not just in the British Isles, but for tens of millions of people in Canada, America, Australia, and even South America. Perhaps nowhere is the romantic appeal of Celticism more evident than in the corpus of modern fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien, a proud Englishman, once remarked that Welsh is of this soil, this island, the senior language of the men of Britain, and Welsh is beautiful. Tolkien's passion for all things Celtic is reflected in the social fabric of Middle-earth. Sindarin, the language of the Grey Elves of Beleriand, was constructed primarily from Welsh vocabulary, while influences from Brythonic and Gaelic folklore are ubiquitous throughout the Silmarillion. Later giants of the genre, like The Witcher's Andrzej Sapkowski and Wheel of Time's Robert Jordan, continued this Celtophilic trend. Consequently, fans of modern fantasy, even ones who don't know a thing about Celtic history or culture, have subconsciously learned to associate quintessentially Celtic motifs with the most ancient, mysterious and magical aspects of the literary worlds they love. All this serves to labour the point that in this day and age, Celtic identity is widely considered a thing to be treasured, which makes it ironic that for all of ancient history, it never existed. Today, the word Celtic enjoys widespread popularity as an ethnic identifier. However, when used in a historical context, the term becomes far more muddy. Although the countless tribes who dominated the forests and hills of Britain in the immediate centuries before the rise of Rome are posthumously labelled as Celts, there is little evidence they considered themselves to be part of anything resembling a single ethnic group. Theoretically, if one acquired a time machine, travelled back to the Britain of the 1st century BC, and roamed the land speaking to the chariot-riding locals in various dialects of ancient Brythonic, said locals would introduce themselves not as Celts, an exonym first introduced in the writings of an ancient Greek, but as warriors of the Catuvellauni, Assini, Brigandes, Domnonii, and so on. However, it cannot be denied that these enigmatic ancient peoples shared common religious practices, social customs, and closely related languages. Greek and Roman writers, a certain Julius Caesar among them, noticed as much, while the material artifacts left behind for modern archaeologists to find also suggest a strong sense of cultural continuity between the so-called Celtic regions of the ancient world. So, in the words of Professor Barry Cunliffe, a rock star of European archaeology, professional historians who refer to the regionally diverse yet ultimately related peoples of Iron Age Britain as the Celts are not being entirely outrageous. Having now discovered the disclaimer to end all disclaimers, let's wind back the clock and travel deep into the fog of prehistory, where the story of Britain's oldest peoples begins. The Celts may be the oldest surviving culture in Britain, but they were not its first. The presence of Homo sapiens on the Isles dates back at least 40,000 years. Agriculture and animal husbandry began developing during the Neolithic period, around 6,000 years ago. These days, the Stone Age is a byword for a primitive, but the Britons of this era were anything but. They lived in sophisticated sedentary dwellings, had vibrant styles of artistic expression, and were capable of transporting massive 25-ton standing stones over vast distances to create giant monuments, the most iconic of which you've probably heard of. Around the 2nd millennium BC, the Bronze Age came to Britain. Bronze is an alloy composed of two metals, copper and tin, and as it so happened, Cornwall and Devon possessed some of the largest reserves of tin in Europe. As such, Britain became the Silicon Valley of the Bronze Age world, the key terminus of a trade network with tendrils that spread across huge swaths of Europe and the Near East. Through intermediary peoples along the Atlantic coastline, British tin made its way as far as the great Levantine cities of Tyre and Sidon. Although the Britons of the Stone Age and early Bronze Age left plenty of cultural belongings behind for archaeologists to analyse, they were not literate societies, so ultimately we know precious little about how they identified themselves and what language they spoke. However, most historians agree they were probably not yet Celtic at this time. This begs the question, when, how, and from where did Celtic culture arrive in Britain? The traditional narrative on the origin of the Celts is the Hallstatt theory, which postulates that Celtic culture originated in the 1st millennium BC in the heart of Central Europe, from where it spread on the backs of ceremonial horse-drawn wagons throughout the continent, eventually reaching Britain. However, in some circles, the Hallstatt theory has recently fallen out of fashion, in favour of a newer theory labelled the Atlantic Celts. This hypothesis argues that the origins of the Celtic language and culture lie not in Central Europe, but along the continent's west coast. Let us set the scene. It was around 1200 BC, and the Mediterranean world was on fire. Marauding sea peoples, whoever the heck they were devastating the coastlines of Egypt, Mycenaean Greece, and the Hittite Empire, bringing those civilizations to their knees, and collapsing the once sophisticated trade networks which connected them. Meanwhile, in the west, things were comparatively hunky-dory. Much as it had been in the early Bronze Age, the Atlantic littoral during this time was a maritime highway upon which trade thrived. Between the pyrite deposits of western Iberia, the gold and copper mines of Brittany and Ireland, and the tin deposits of Cornwall, there was plenty of wealth to go around for those communities that faced the endless sapphire horizon. Between the 13th and 7th centuries BC, artifacts along the Atlantic coastline start becoming more homogeneous. From Iberia to Ireland, the presence in the archaeological record of nearly identical-looking carp's tongue swords, concentric patterned round shields, ritual war wagons, and large cooking cauldrons suggests the emergence of a culturally uniform social caste of warrior elites whose way of life revolved around martial prowess and ritual feasting. Moreover, the fact that these artifacts are often found in the context of religious offerings thrown into lakes, rivers, and bogs indicates the emergence of a shared belief system involving the appeasement of the chthonic gods of the earth. Finally, it is likely that as this shared value system evolved, so too did a lingua franca, a common form of speech through which it was spread. Thus, as the theory goes, the culture and language that spread along the Atlantic coastline in the late Bronze Age was the earliest form of the Celtic package. This would make the Celts of Britain not the westernmost extremity of a migratory expansion which began in the Alpine mountains, but as part of the original coastal heartland from where the culture originated. When exploring the ethnogenesis of Celtic Britain from a modern archaeological lens, there is an overall lesson to take away. Since the ancient Celts had no written records of their own, historians have traditionally been overwhelmingly reliant on the writings of Greek and Roman authors for literary accounts of their society. From that perspective, Britain was always at the edge of the world, a land of barbarians, too far from the centres of civilization to be relevant to anything or anyone. However, as we have now seen, this was hardly the case. For millennia before the Roman legions set foot on the island, Britain was a dynamic cultural hub and vibrant commercial entrepot, with an influence that projected across thousands of miles. In the words of Barry Cunliffe, the Celts of Britain and their Bronze Age ancestors were far from the distant benighted periphery to the bright and beautiful Mediterranean, but part of a cohesive cultural zone capable of spectacular development built on homegrown innovation. The 8th century BC marks the twilight of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. During this time, we can assume that the Celtic culture which had developed on the Atlantic coast began an eastwards march into inland France, Iberia, southern Germany, Austria, Bohemia, and other places the Celtic culture is known to have thrived in the immediate centuries before the rise of the Roman Empire. In these places, Celtic warrior elites came into contact with other wealthy, sophisticated societies, such as the Greeks via the colony of Massalia, the Etruscans of northern Italy, and the nomadic Scythian horse lords. The cultural influences of these foreign peoples, along with the fantastic wealth that establishing exchange networks with them brought, resulted in the development of a dynamic new Celtic cultural package known today as the La Tène culture. Developing in 4 separate tribal centres, principally along the Moselle and Marne rivers, La Tène soon expanded across much of Europe. Lasting from around 450 to 50 BC, the La Tène period is the most iconic era of ancient Celtic history. Its artwork is what the conventional mind considers quintessentially Celtic, featuring cauldrons, drinking vessels, weapons, shields, armour and jewellery, characterized by stylistic spiral patterns. It was also during the La Tène apex that the Celtic world came crashing headlong into the Greco-Roman one. Indeed, it was during these centuries that ancient Celtic warbands sacked Rome, invaded the Balkans and Greece, settled in Anatolia, and then got Uno reversed by Rome in a centuries-long staggered conquest, which ultimately ended with Vercingetorix throwing his arms at Julius Caesar's feet, and, more relevant to this story, Emperor Claudius pointing his legions across the Channel to Britain, the last Celtic frontier. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we launch into the arrival of the Imperial Eagle on Albion's shores, let us first take a brief pause from the march of history and paint a picture of what society in Iron Age Britain, as part of the La Tène cultural world, would have looked like immediately before the Roman conquest. First, let us talk about the linguistic landscape. While there was likely once a single Proto-Celtic language, by the late Iron Age it had diverged into several related yet mutually unintelligible forms of speech. Throughout most of what is now England and Wales, a language called Common Brittonic was spoken. This tongue was probably mutually intelligible with the Gaulish language spoken across much of continental Europe around the same time. Echoing across the rocky crags of the Scottish Highlands was the Pictish language, a tongue so poorly attested to that historians debate whether it was a dialect of Common Brittonic, its own distinct Celtic language, or even a non-Celtic language entirely. Finally, spoken in Ireland was the lilting prose of Gaelic. This language formed a separate branch of the Celtic language family, which Celtiberian, another divergent Celtic language spoken in Spain, was probably also part of. The linguistic diversity of Iron Age Britain is still reflected in the Celtic languages of today, which are split into two branches: the descendants of Common Brittonic, Welsh, Cornish and Breton, and the descendants of Old Gaelic, Irish, Manx and Scottish Gaelic. Society in Iron Age Britain was highly decentralised and divided up into a patchwork of tribal territories. Generally speaking, the landscape was dominated by elevated hill forts, where a local chieftain and his cadre of warrior elites kept a watchful eye over the handful of surrounding farming communities. Indeed, while the ancient Celts are often, somewhat rightfully, portrayed as an extremely bellicose people, it should be noted that after accounting for a chieftain, his warrior aristocracy, and a small caste of specialized crafts and artisans, 90% of Celtic society consisted of unglamorous yet economically crucial subsistence farmers. After all, everyone, mighty warlords included, needed to eat. Still, Celtic Britain society was no doubt a warlike one, with social prestige directly linked to feats of strength and victories won in combat. As such, fighting between communities, while probably mostly small in scale, was routine and ritualized. Warfare among the Iron Age Britons was probably not conducted all that differently from how their Gaulish brothers on the continent went about it. All in all, facing these warbands across the battlefield was a horrifying experience. Both Roman and Greek records report on the terrifying nature of the Celts, claiming that before any engagement, they would roar and brag, performing ritualistic war dances, while bellowing a deafening din out of their boar-headed war trumpets. All this may seem juvenile to the modern observer, but if one puts themselves in the shoes of a superstitious plebeian fresh off an ancient olive farm or the slums of Rome, one can appreciate the nigh supernatural terror that a mob of screaming, dancing, horn-blaring muscle men must have had. One thing that set British warriors apart from their Gallic kinsmen during this era was their mastery of the war chariot. A sleek two-wheeled horse-drawn vehicle, the chariot had become a mainstay throughout the Celtic world during the early La Tène period, replacing the cumbersome four-wheeled ritual wagons which had served as symbols of power since the Bronze Age. However, by the time the continental Celts were duking it out with the Greco-Roman world, the chariot had fallen out of use as a battlefield unit in favour of mounted cavalry. Yet in Britain it persisted as an instrument of war, and would later confound the likes of Julius Caesar, whose legions had never encountered such vehicles until their foray into the Foggy Isle. Another aspect of Celtic Britain society that puzzled the strictly patriarchal Romans was the apparent normalization of women wielding positions of political or military power. Exactly how much political capital and social equality women had in both ancient Britain and the rest of the Celtic world is still a matter of debate among modern historians. However, the Roman writer Tacitus, in his book Agricola, remarked that the Britons make no distinction of gender among their leaders. However, it should be noted that Tacitus made that remark to contextualize the story of a certain specific warrior queen, whose story will absolutely be covered later in this documentary. Greek and Roman writings and sculptures have given us a romanticized image of the average Celt as a towering, red-maned noble savage, sporting a manly moustache while painted head to toe in terrifying war paint. In reality, the average ancient Briton would not have been much taller than the average Roman or Greek. While fashion differed from region to region, Iron Age Celts tended to dress conservatively in their day-to-day life. Men generally wore long-sleeved tunics and baggy trousers woven from flax and wool. Women tended to wear long dresses, while both sexes were often draped in cloaks, decorated with colourful plaid patterns rendered from natural dyes of copper, berries, plants, and stale urine. Personal grooming was highly important to the Celts. For example, both sexes were said to meticulously and painfully pluck all their body hairs. Additionally, there is some truth to the stereotypical depiction of the thick warrior's moustache, depicted often in both Celtic and Greco-Roman iconography. It was likely a common fashion among Celtic men, and was believed to be a sign of manhood and virility. Celtic warriors were also said to have washed their hair in a mixture of slaked lime and water, which stiffened it into stiff white spikes. Jewelry was a common accessory among the upper classes. The brooch, a fastener for a cloak, was a remarkably enduring characteristic of Celtic fashion for centuries. Bracelets and arm rings were common, fashioned in the ornate swirling style characteristic of Latin art. Celtic jewelry often had cultural or spiritual significance. The torque, a weight metal neck ring, was perhaps the most important ornament. Beyond its value as a symbol of status and rank, it bore a deep religious importance, said to bestow the protection of the gods to whoever wore it. The Celts of Britain shared much of their physical characteristics with their Gaulish cousins on the continental mainland. But one thing unique to the islands was the practice of ritual tattoos. According to Roman accounts, the ancient Britons rendered a bluish dye from the Asatis tinctoria flower called woad, which, when applied to their flesh, was said to provide magic protection in battle. Now let us touch upon the complex topic of religion. The Celtic gods did not belong to an ordered pantheon like the Greco-Roman Olympians, and spirituality across the Celtic world was not uniform. Today we know of over 400 Celtic deities, most of which were the patron of a single tribe or a local god associated with a certain area. However, there were also gods who were prominent across the Celtic world. These would include the thunder-wielding Taranis, Mapinos, the god of youth, Belinus, the sun god, Cernunnos, the horned one, Epona, the horse goddess, and Tutatis, the warlike pan-tribal protector. Ancient Celtic religion was a highly ritualized, deeply sophisticated belief system, which in many cases was facilitated by a class of professional priests. It is here we come to perhaps the most iconically enigmatic aspect of Celtic society, the Druids. Today, the Druids conjure up a popular image of mysterious, long-bearded elders in white robes harvesting mistletoe in ancient woodlands. However, far from being simple forest sages, Druids wielded massive political influence, often serving as peacemakers and diplomats on behalf of their chieftains, mediating legal matters, serving as healers, and heading education in their tribe. Training in order to become a Druid involved an intense 20-year regimen in which a decadent had to memorize a massive array of oral histories, religious lore, medicinal knowledge, astronomy, and of course, religious rituals and divination practices. Much of our knowledge about Druidic practices can be attributed to the writings of the man, the myth, the legend himself, Julius Caesar. According to him, the Druids hosted a pan-tribal meeting each year in the forests of the Canites, a sacred ground in northern France, where major political or religious issues were settled between tribes. However, the center of Druidic studies, the Harvard of the Druidic world, so to speak, was located in Britain. Indeed, the sacred Isle of Anglesey, located in what is now northern Wales, would later be the stage of the violent climax of Rome's relations with the Druidic order. One of the key duties of a Druid was to officiate sacrifices to the gods, sacrifices which often were of a human nature. Human sacrifice is a common taboo associated with ancient Celtic religion, and is often described by Roman writers as a core part of Celtic practice. According to the Roman author Lucan, different gods called for different forms of ritual slaughter. Tutatis' victims were drowned in a vat of water, while Taranis called for men to be beheaded or burned alive in giant effigies of straw. Human sacrifices often involved divination rites, The Greek historian Diodorus attested to a practice in which a victim was butchered so that his entrails could be read to interpret the will of the gods. It should be noted, however, that the Druids never wrote anything down and kept much of their knowledge a closely guarded secret, restricted to members of their order. We will never have their own accounts of their religious rites, while the Roman authors who wrote about these practices had a vested interest in making their Celtic enemies look savage and barbarous. It would be revisionist to deny the existence of human sacrifice entirely, but we should also keep in mind the limited perspective that modern scholars have offered on the subject. Speaking of the Romans, their influence was felt on Britain long before a single legionary had ever planted his collegae on the beaches of Dover. Although the Britons' distant Gallic cousins in northern Italy had once brought the Eternal City to its knees, and then kept the young republic confined to its native peninsula for well over a century, the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC had seen a reversal in fortunes, as the dauntless maniples of the Latins pushed back the Italian Celts, breached the Alps, and then emerged into the plains beyond, subjugating much of southwestern continental Gaul. With the benefit of hindsight, modern observers may see the slowly narrowing expanse between Rome and Britain as nothing more than the ominous foreshadowing of a conquest to come. However, for a time, the burgeoning republic's increased proximity made the chiefs of Britain exceptionally wealthy. Through a sophisticated network of tribal intermediaries along the Atlantic coastline, southeastern Britain and late Republican Rome were connected in a system of material exchange which enriched both worlds, with the Britons exporting metals, corn, hides, and slaves in exchange for a slew of Mediterranean luxuries such as wine, figs, and exotic glass ornaments. However, as is often the case in history, sometimes all it takes to shake up a comfortable status quo is the ambitions of one man. Indeed, in the mid-1st century BC, a certain vociferous general, descended from Venus herself, crowd-surfed upon the white cliffs of Dover. Gaius Julius Caesar had arrived, and with him, the long saga of war between Roman and Britain had begun. The year was 55 BC, and Julius Caesar had been rampaging around northern Gaul for 3 years. What had begun as a particularly dramatic episode of border patrol against the migratory Helvetii tribe had evolved into a grand, protracted military campaign to conquer the very heart of the Gallic world. The year 55 BC marked the 1-year consulship of Crassus and Pompey, the two statesmen who, alongside Caesar, formed the illustrious First Triumvirate. By this point, Caesar's relationship with these two esteemed friends and colleagues of his was quickly developing into a rivalry, and with Crassus and Pompey now in a position of immense political power, Caesar needed political capital of his own, which he could only gain by doing something so bold that it would earn him enough prestige to stay in the public eye. To that end, he resolved to go with his legions where no Roman had gone before, across the tempestuous Atlantic Ocean and onto the lands that lay beyond. As previously mentioned, all Roman exposure to Britain thus far had been indirect. To the average legionnaire, Britain was the mysterious, foggy edge of the world, and it was even popular in some Roman scholarly circles to deny the island existed at all. Caesar, of course, knew better, for he had gathered a decent amount of second-hand information about the island from northern Gaulish notables, who had long maintained diplomatic ties with the Britons. Since I want more followers on my Twitch stream than Crassus and Pompey wasn't considered a valid reason to invade an entire country in the framework of Rome's legalistic approach to international relations, Caesar reasoned that his casus belli was to punish the Britons for supporting his enemies in mainland Gaul. In fairness, there may have been some truth to this. Back during the 2nd century BC, chieftains of the Gallic Belgae tribes migrated across the Channel, establishing themselves as local rulers around what is now southeastern England. They introduced the practice of minting coins to the island. These coins weren't used as a form of standardized currency per se, but rather as special political tokens, which, when exchanged between two chieftains, tied them together in obligations of friendship and mutual aid. This indicates that cross-strait alliances between tribes of Britain and Gaul were commonplace. In fact, according to Caesar, shortly before his time, a Belgic king, Diviciacus of the Suessiones, commanded the fealty of tribes on both sides of the Channel. After a brief detour across the Rhine River to massacre some Germans, Caesar prepared to make the journey across the wine-dark expanse. He questioned some Gallic sea merchants, who regularly did business across the Channel for intel about Britain, its people, customs, military tactics, and good harbours to make landfall. But the merchants were tight-lipped, not wanting to give up valuable information which could hurt their bottom line. Ahead of his invasion, Caesar also sent Commius, one of his client kings among the mainland Belgae, across the Channel, hoping his prestigious Belgic lineage would aid him in convincing some of the British chieftains to swear fealty to Rome. At midnight on August 23rd, Julius Caesar set forth from Portius Itius at the head of 2 legions, the 7th and 10th, alongside a contingent of 500 cavalry. Immediately there were problems. Summer weather conditions across the English Channel were fickle and hazardous. Due to contrary winds, 18 of Caesar's transport ships, which just happened to be the ones ferrying his cavalry, were blown back to the mainland. Nevertheless, by 9 AM the next morning, the remainder of the Roman fleet had spotted the horizon, and what a sight it was! A massive sheer cliff of pure white, rising straight from the ocean as if the sword of a god had cleaved down upon the coast. The White Cliffs of Dover are one of Britain's most iconic natural landmarks, but they make for an absolutely horrible place to disembark an invading army. Worse still, the Romans had been expected, for as their ships approached, they spotted a line of painted warriors staring down at them from the clifftop, howling and roaring, ready for battle. Rather than linger where the enemy could indefinitely lob missiles down at them from a sheltered high ground, Caesar ordered his fleet to sail northeastwards until the cliffs began to drop away. Eventually, the Romans came upon what modern archaeologists believe to be Pegwell Bay on Thanet Peninsula, where they once again encountered the British warband awaiting them on the sands, having been stalking their ships down the coast the entire time. This was a highly mobile force, comprised in large part of cavalrymen, and more notably charioteers, a unit that Caesar's troops would have been unfamiliar with. The invaders resolved to disembark and confront their foes, but even here it was a daunting task. Filled to the brim with armoured men, the transport ships were too low in the water to sail close to the shore, meaning that the legionnaires would have to disembark in deep water in heavy armour, hampering their mobility and perilously exposing them to missile fire. No man dared to make the plunge, until, according to Caesar's account, the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion roared, "Leap, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, for my part, will perform my duty to the Republic and to my general." Properly chastised, the Romans began leaping overboard. The battle had begun. As the legionnaires approached the shore, they were battered upon by a withering hail of missile fire, likely consisting of slings, arrows, and javelins in equal measure. However, the soldiers of the Republic pushed through this deadly downpour, and upon reaching shallow water, managed to form an orderly battle line. When they reached the beach, a wall of fearless, howling warriors crashed into this line, but the legionnaires held, Latin discipline measuring up to Celtic ferocity. Caesar calmly watched on from aboard a ship. Whenever he spotted a section of the line about to break, he deployed small platoons of shipboard reserves onto little rowboats, which ferried themselves onto the beach to shore up the crack. As British cavalrymen and charioteers attempted to outflank their enemy, they were pelted by catapultae, mounted artillery aboard the Roman vessels. Eventually a signal was given, and the Britons withdrew. Composed mostly of mobile mounted units, the Britons were able to peel off and disappear into the woods easily, while the Romans, composed only of heavy infantry, were unable to pursue. Still, the Romans had successfully established a beachhead and quickly erected a fortified camp. Night fell without further incident, and in the morning, ambassadors arrived from some of the local tribes. These dignitaries came in peace and brought with them a familiar face, Commius, Caesar's Gaulish client king. Apparently, Commius's attempts to sway the Britons into accepting Roman overlordship had not impressed them, for they had immediately arrested the Belgic ruler, but now those same Britons had apparently changed their tune. They claimed they had no affiliation with the angry rabble who had formed yesterday's welcoming committee and offered Caesar valuable hostages to ensure their compliance. Caesar had only been in Britain for 2 days, but in that time he had made a show of strength in the beach engagement and compelled at least some local notables to pay homage to him. So far so good. However, the proconsul's fortunes immediately did a 180 in the following days. When the ships carrying Caesar's cavalry once again attempted to cross the channel, they were caught in a fierce storm and blown far off course. That same storm wrecked the transport ships anchored off the beach, sinking some and rendering others inoperable. In a foreign and unfamiliar land, with no mobile scouts and running low on food, Caesar was now stranded. This fact was not lost on the Britons. Realizing that if they could entrap him until the winter, they could starve him out, the natives renewed the attack. Caesar immediately set up routine foraging parties to gather both food and lumber to repair his ships. But his noose was tightening. One night, under the shroud of darkness, the British hostages slipped out of the Roman camp unnoticed. Not long after, a squadron of charioteers ambushed a Roman foraging party. Reinforcements from the camp drove off this attack, but a few days later, a massive army appeared from the tree line before the Roman stockade. Evidently, the natives had been hard at work forming a large tribal coalition to crush Caesar's ambitions for good. Yet once again the legionnaires held the line. In this they had unlikely aid from Commius, who had been able to scrounge up some local support after all, likely from the traditional enemies of the tribes who opposed Caesar. With an improvised force of native British cavalry supporting them, the Romans prevailed, and the hostile Briton horde was routed. Following this, the Romans were able to finish the makeshift repairs on their ships, which they hastily boarded and promptly returned to Gaul. Caesar's invasion of Britain had quite frankly been a failure, and he had been lucky to get away with his life. Of course, anyone remotely familiar with the man would know he was not exactly the leave good enough alone type. So he immediately began planning Invasion 2 Electric Boogaloo, and this time there would be no half measures. The invasion force that assembled at Portius Itius in the summer of 54 BC was over double the size of the one from the previous year, consisting of 5 full legions, comprising up to 25,000 professional soldiers. They would be transported aboard an armada of 600 ships. They were not the leaky tubs from the previous invasion, which had proven so vulnerable to the wrath of Tyrannus, the Celtic god of thunderstorms. Instead, these new vessels had taken inspiration from the ships of the seagoing Gallic Veneti tribe, making them far more suitable for enduring the capricious channel winds. Accompanying him was a force of Gallic cavalry, led by various local chieftains from northern Gaul. By bringing these Gallic kings along with him on the campaign, he reduced the risk of rebellion on the continent while he was away on the island, and also sent a simple message to the Britons: "I have compelled your kinsmen across the sea to do as I command, and by Jupiter I will do the same to you." The fleet cast off on the night of July the 6th, with Caesar leaving behind his subordinate Labienus at Portius Itius to manage a cross-channel supply chain, so that unlike last time, the Roman expedition in Britain could be regularly re-provisioned. The fleet came within sight of misty Albion the following morning. They landed likely where they had the previous year, at Peguel Bay. This time there was no native horde on the sands to greet them. Upon landfall, Caesar immediately established a fortified beachhead, then took the lion's share of his forces and marched inland to find the enemy's position. At a crossing along the river Stour, the legionaries discovered a large British force. A battle ensued, in which the Romans gained the upper hand, prompting the Britons to zip off on their speedy chariots. This time Caesar had the cavalry to pursue, but the sun was falling and the terrain was unfamiliar, so he decided to play it safe and make camp. The next morning, the proconsul received word that yet another storm had wreaked serious damage to his ships. The damage was not nearly as bad as it had been last year, but nevertheless Caesar was forced to return to the beach and prioritize repairing his boats. Meanwhile, many tribes of Britain had put aside their differences and united around their mightiest warlord, a man named Cassivellaunus. Far more than just some barbarian brute, Cassivellaunus possessed a strategic mind that rivaled Caesar's own. Realizing his lightly armored Celtic warriors could not defeat the Romans' heavy infantry in a pitched battle, he pinned his hopes upon the 4,000 chariots under his command. After the Roman cavalry fended off some raids on his foraging parties, Caesar once again assembled the bulk of his forces and marched inland towards the River Thames. During this hellish advance, Cassivellaunus's fast and furious street racers harassed the Roman column like a swarm of wasps. Using hit-and-run tactics, the charioteers swerved in close and hurled javelins at the invaders. Then Tokyo drifted away the moment they were pursued, disappearing into the woods. The Roman cavalry did their best to swat away these attacks, but pursuing them was perilous. At one point, a contingent of Roman riders was lured deep into the forest and ambushed on all sides. However, just like last time, Caesar received a bit of Deus Ex Machina in the form of local support. Not every tribe in southeastern Britain was super down with Cassivellaunus being in charge. The Trinovantes were particularly unhappy. Recently, Cassivellaunus had killed their king and forced his son, Mandubracius, into exile. Sometime before the invasion of Britain, Mandubracius had fled to Gaul, where he had become a ward of Caesar. Now the Trinovantes approached the proconsul, offering him submission if their prince was returned to them. Caesar happily complied, and soon after, 5 other tribes with grievances against Cassivellaunus, the Cenemagni, Segontiaci, Ancalites, Bibroci and Cassi, also came forth and supplicated themselves. Caesar's new native allies gifted him with an invaluable piece of information, the location of Cassivellaunus's hill fort, which was probably located at the modern site of Devil's Dyke in Hertfordshire. Caesar beelined it to this stronghold, wanting to finally force his wily foe into the pitched engagement which had thus far eluded him. Knowing the storm was approaching his very doorstep, Cassivellaunus sent word to his allies Cingetorix, Carvilius, Taximagalus, and Segovax, the 4 kings of Kent, and instructed them to stage a diversionary attack on the Roman beachhead to force Caesar to divert his forces. Ultimately, this was a failed gambit, for the rump guard on the beach was able to repel the 4 chieftains' assault, and after a short encirclement and siege, Caesar was able to capture Cassivellaunus's fortress, although apparently was not able to capture the warlord himself. Still, his warrior's moustache heavily singed, Cassivellaunus decided to throw in the towel and enter negotiations with his patricianly foe. The terms of surrender were fairly lenient. Cassivellaunus delivered valuable hostages into Caesar's hands, agreed to pay an annual tribute to Rome, and promised not to seek revenge against the Trinovantes or any other tribes who had turned against him, which were now under Roman protection. Following this settlement, the proconsul departed with his armies. He had unfinished business in mainland Gaul and had to set forth before the peak of the stormy season. Ultimately, Gaius Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain did not set up any permanent Roman presence on the island, although it did set a precedent of various chieftains in the southeast of Britain becoming autonomous client kings under Roman influence and protection. This status quo would endure for generations, but a century later, the imperial eagle would return to British shores, and this time it was there to stay. The year was 41 AD, and the Roman Empire had a new princeps. Claudius was not the type of man one typically calls an emperor. A shy and frail boy who struggled with a limp and a speech impediment, he had stumbled into the imperial purple only because he was too pathetic to be seen as a threat during the political purges committed by the mad Emperor Caligula, and had been the only member of the imperial family left to take the throne after Caligula's assassination. But he was no fool, and knew that in order to win the support of his soldiers, he needed to shake off his craven reputation and engage in a grand conquest like his great dynastic ancestors Caesar and Augustus. For that, he chose the one corner of the Celtic world which had not yet been made fully subordinate to the Roman Empire. Recently, Caratacus, king of the Cativalani, had been making aggressive expansions of his own, conquering the Trinovantes' tribal capital of Camulodunum and deposing Verica, the erstwhile king of the Atrebates. Both the Atrebates and Trinovantes were Roman clients, and Caratacus' predecessor, Cassivellaunus, had agreed to respect the latter's sovereignty in the treaty he had made with Caesar a century ago. Because of this, Claudius was hand-gifted a valid casus belli for his invasion of Britain, with his expedition framed as a mission to protect Rome's allies and punish Caratacus for violating the treaty signed by his forebear. In the year 43 AD, 98 years since Julius Caesar forayed into Britain for the first time, Roman troops began assembling in Gessoriacum in preparation to cross the Channel. To lead this invasion, Claudius appointed Aulus Plautius, a distinguished senator and capable general. The force that gathered consisted of Legio 14 Gemina, Legio 20 Valeria, Legio 9 Hispana, commanded by one Gnaeus Hesidius Geta, and Legio 2 Augusta, which was notable for being commanded by Vespasian, the future emperor of Rome. In addition to the regular legionaries, auxiliaries from the empire's conquered peoples were called upon. These were drawn principally from the Germanic Batavi tribe and the native tribes of Gaul, who were levied by their imperial masters to participate in the subjugation of their British cousins. All told, the invasion force amounted to 45,000 light infantry, heavy infantry, and cavalry, with half of that number consisting of Roman citizens and the other half consisting of Gaulish and Batavian auxiliaries. By Claudius's time, Gaul had been thoroughly incorporated into the Roman Empire, but the Celtic tribes of Britain still held a mystic aura in Roman eyes. This was nothing new, of course. The Gauls of the continent had also once been seen as supernatural demons, only to be thoroughly demystified through centuries of contact and conquest. But to the Romans of the 1st century AD, Britain was a land wreathed in the fog of mystery, full of untamed, long-haired savages streaked with haunting blue tattoos that gave them the mien of vengeful spirits. Of course, southeastern Britain had been in the Roman sphere of influence ever since Caesar's hot girl summer in Kent a century earlier, but to the average plebeian legionary without higher education in contemporary geography and geopolitics, Britain was little more than a land of spirits and bogeymen. Thus, even before the invasion force set sail, Aulus Plautius was faced with a major mutiny on his hands. His men flatly refused to cross the ocean, which was considered to be the boundary of the proper world of mankind. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, this mutiny was nipped in the bud when Narcissus, an ex-slave in service of Emperor Claudius, mounted General Plautius's tribunal and began haranguing the soldiers for their cowardice. Either deeply humiliated or amused at being chastised by a former slave of all things, the legionnaires erupted with shouts of Io Saturnalia, a reference to the Roman festival where slaves became masters for a night, and resolved to follow Plautius across the sea. The aforementioned Cassius Dio, whose writings were incidentally the only ancient source that chronicles this invasion, do not state where Plautius's invasion force made landfall, but modern archaeologists confidently place the location at Richborough, Kent. Disembarking 45,000 men and all their horses, equipment and provisions on a beach was a long and cumbersome process, which made it all the more peculiar that the Romans were able to do so unhindered. No native force had come to oppose the Roman landing. It is highly likely that a large Cativalani-led coalition army had been waiting on the beaches of Kent up until recently. But after hearing about the mutiny of the Roman troops from cross-channel Gaulish traders, the threat of imminent invasion was greatly diminished, and most of the gathered tribes dispersed and returned to their farms. From Richborough, Plautius led his expedition westwards along the river Stour, where still he encountered no native resistance. However, this calm before the storm would not last. By now, the Cativalani and their allies were frenziedly rousing to arms. As soon as word of the Roman landing spread throughout the land, their massive, multi-tribal army began to reconstitute itself, led by King Caratacus and his brother Togodumnus. Cassius Dio fails to name the location where the British force gathered, but the consensus of modern historians is that the two brothers chose to make their stand somewhere along the west bank of the River Medway. This dynamic duo of Cativaloni royals likely commanded the fealty of nearly all the tribes of southern Britain, and were capable of assembling a massive horde. However, it would take time for this pan-tribal force to filter in from outlying regions. As such, the brothers deployed a vanguard to delay the Roman advance. When Plautius attempted to ford the Stour River at a place near modern Canterbury, he finally encountered armed resistance from the warriors of the Cantiaci. According to Cassius Dio, the Romans handily batted away this advance guard and secured its surrender. Around this time, another tribe, the Dobuni, approached Plautius with their emissaries and supplicated before the imperial eagle. Plautius left behind a small contingent of soldiers to build a fort near Canterbury and secure his initial land gains, then continued westwards towards where the main indigenous host was gathering to oppose him. After crossing the Stour, the Roman army likely advanced in a broad column along a prehistoric trackway which had been maintained by the Britons and their ancestors since the Stone Age. Eventually, they arrived upon the east bank of the Medway River, likely at a shallow but marshy ford about 4 miles above present-day Rochester. There, the legionnaires and their auxiliaries came face to face with the dragon they had come to slay, an absolutely massive throng of painted warriors staring them down from the opposite side of the water. Cassius Dio does not provide us with the numbers of Caratacus and Togodumnus' army, but historians have asserted that the Briton host may have numbered a staggering 150,000. Whether or not this number is exaggerated, the natives certainly outnumbered the invaders by a significant number. The 4 legions fanned out into a long battle line along the riverbank, and a tense standoff ensued. The ball was in the Romans' court, for the Britons' main objective was simply to hold their position, and the onus to advance was on the invaders. However, launching a full frontal assault across the water would be disastrous for the Latins, and both Plautius and the Cativaloni brothers knew it. According to Cassius Dio, the Britons were quite overconfident about their position, for they pitched their camp in a rather careless fashion, not expecting the Romans to be able to cross the river. It is hard to believe that a pair of battle-hardened warlords like Caratacus and Togodumnus would be so naive to believe that some 500 yards of water would stop the Roman war machine dead in its tracks. But if we take Cassius Dio's account of the supposed arrogance of the barbarians at face value, then their hubris would be their undoing. Plautius knew he needed to create a diversion before attempting to ford the river with his main army. To that end, he set up a ruse, ordering the legions to look busy and move about purposefully to convince the enemy that full-scale preparations were being made for an immediate assault. While the Britons watched all this with fascinated anticipation, Plautius deployed his Batavians to quietly enter the water some distance upstream and make a stealth crossing. Natives to the marshy lowlands of what is now Holland, the Batavians were experts in swimming across even the fastest of rivers in full arms and armour. The Germanic auxiliaries made it onto the British side of the Medway unnoticed. From there, they attacked not the dense mass of native warriors pressed on the bank, but their chariots and tethered horses, which would have been parked in a cluster behind the horde and left relatively unguarded. The Batavians fell upon these war vehicles, smashing wheels and hamstringing the legs of the steeds which pulled them. When the British realised what had happened, they were likely thrown into a rage. The horse and chariot were a Briton's symbol of status and martial pride, and to have them so savagely vandalised would have undoubtedly thrown many a warrior elite into an apoplectic fury. As the Batavians withdrew back across the water, and a chaos-engulfed native horde gravitated its attention towards their maimed steeds, Plautius had finally achieved the diversion he needed. The die cast, he commanded Vespasian to lead Legio II Augusta across the river. The 2nd Legion apparently managed to make it onto the opposite bank unnoticed. When the Britons realised that they had been outmanoeuvred, they threw themselves against the advance force. However, Vespasian held the line, his 5,000-some legionaries withstanding the tsunami of Celtic ferocity that crashed against their scutums. The Romans had successfully established a bridgehead on the British side of the river, with the Britons forced to pull back and regroup. As night fell, Plautius ordered Legio IX Hispania under Hosadius Geta to make the crossing under the cover of darkness and reinforce Vespasian. The next day, fighting began anew. Far from being routed, the Britons fell upon the Romans with renewed viciousness. Without any regard for their own lives, wave after wave of half-naked Celtic screamers threw themselves upon the bristling shield wall of their steel-clad foes. Evidently, the Britons initially had the upper hand, and were able to create some perilous fissures within the Roman line. At one point, Cassius Dio notes that Legio IX was under serious threat of being swamped, with Hosadius Geta himself narrowly escaping capture. Evidently, it was Geta who turned the tide. Instilled with a valorous second wind, the legate of the Ninth rallied his men and turned the tide, probably successfully executing an encircling movement, which ultimately put the British horde to flight. The Battle of Medway ended in a decisive victory for the Romans. Although Caratacus and Togodumnus had both escaped the battlefield, the army they had assembled had likely sustained massive casualties, and their prospects in fielding a force large enough to face Plautius's 4 legions head-on again were grim. The Romans were now effectively the masters of lowland southern Britain. After the battle, Caratacus and Togodumnus fell back to the Thames with what remained of their army, the Romans in hot pursuit. According to Cassius Dio, the Britons crossed the water at a point where the river discharged into the ocean and formed a lake at flood tide. The brother kings of the Cativaloni hoped to use this complex terrain to make another stand against the imperial advance, despite their diminished numbers. However, it seems that Plautius was able to either find a pre-existing bridge further upstream, or have his soldiers construct a pontoon. Crossing with his legions while his Batavian stalkers swam across the water on a different stretch of the river, the invaders engaged the enemy from several sides at once, cutting many of them down. This caused another British rout, but as the Romans pursued without due precaution, large groups of legionnaires got lost in the marshes where they were ambushed and cut down. During this battle, Togodumnus appears to have been killed. According to Cassius Dio, the Cativaloni king's death reinvigorated the fighting spirit of thoroughly battered Britons with a thirst for revenge. At this point, Caratacus had probably come to terms with the fact that he no longer had the manpower to face the Roman legions head-on. Bidding his anguished farewells to his kinsfolk in the eastern lowlands, who he was now forced to leave to the mercies of the imperial eagle, he and his followers retreated into the hilly highlands of western Britain, where they intended to launch a stubborn, persistent and brutal guerrilla war against the inevitable Roman advance. And yet that advance did not occur. For now, Plautius refrained from marching into the hills, choosing instead to consolidate what was already in his possession. Despite having taken little to no part in the actual conquest, Emperor Claudius was anxious to bask in its glories. Thus, with the southeastern portion of the island cleared of all resistance, Plautius sent for his Augustus. The imperial procession arrived in August with the emperor, his praetorian guard, and a contingent of war elephants. Shortly after his arrival, Claudius rode into the Cativaloni capital of Camulodunum, which had been abandoned by Caratacus during his westward retreat. There, dignitaries from many local tribes approached to offer their submission. For most Britons, it would have been an imposing sight indeed. The imperial overlord, cloaked in resplendent purple, mounted atop a massive grey monster in the capital where their defeated king once ruled. New times were upon them, and the land of Britain now had new masters. However, the Roman conquest of Britain had still only just begun, and it would take decades still for her legions to tame even the southern half of the island, let alone the wild, mountainous north. Par for the course in Celtic history, disunity hampered the British war effort. Some tribes with already Roman-leaning leaders, like the Iceni, submitted quickly and were allowed to retain limited independence as client kings under Roman rule. Even the resistance leader Caratacus himself was captured by Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes, who handed him to the Romans in chains. However, resistance continued in the northwest, spearheaded by the Silures and Ordovices tribes, who used guerrilla hit-and-run tactics to stymie the imperial advance for over a decade. Still, the Roman war machine proved relentless, and by 60 AD, was encroaching upon the island of Innsmouth, one of the most important religious sites in Britain, and home to the island's Druidic order. Like their continental brothers, the Druids of Britain had been one of the primary driving forces of resistance against the empire. When a Roman army, led by Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, arrived on the Sacred Isle, he came face to face with a line of chanting wizards clad in occult robes, standing behind wild priestesses wreathed in black, waving torches and screaming curses in the eerie Brythonic tongue. The extremely superstitious legionnaires stood paralyzed in utter terror at the magic of the Druids, but Paulinus screamed courage into his men, and the Romans rallied, slaughtering all before them and burning every sacred grove on the island to the ground. The scouring of the holiest site in Britain was meant to crush the native spirit, and yet the resistance continued, its torch passed on to an iconic warrior queen who needs no introduction. During the initial Roman invasion, the Iceni, a Brittonic tribe based in the east of the island, allied with the Romans as a means to secure protection. They paid tribute to the empire, but were ruled by their own kings, who saw the way the wind was blowing. In 60 AD, the Iceni king Prasutagus died. In his will, the Roman Emperor Nero was made co-heir with the king's two daughters. Prasutagus did this in order to safeguard his kingdom and household, and to ease them into Roman rule, but his attempts to play nice with the new overlords would be for naught, and end up bringing nothing but woe unto his next of kin. After the Iceni king's death, Roman legions marched to seize the tribe's entire territory. According to Tacitus, Prasutagus's kingdom and household alike were plundered like prizes of war, and Iceni lands were earmarked for annexation into the Roman province. This was a quintessential example of the underlying harsh and oppressive conditions of the Roman occupation of Britain. We only have Roman accounts of the period, but even these are enough to reveal terrible misadministration, ranging from cruelly negligent to downright criminal. It is possible that the Procurator of Britain would have been under constant pressure to improve his cash flow, and the temptation of Iceni riches was too much to pass up on. In addition, the forced levy of young adolescent warriors into the Roman legions as auxilia was almost universally detested. Whatever the reasoning, when the king's widow, Queen Boudica, protested against this treatment, she was flogged, and her daughters were abused by Roman soldiers. Furious at this humiliation and wishing to force the Romans off their lands, in the year 60 CE, Boudica raised her people to war. In gathering an alliance to oppose the imperial occupiers, the Iceni were quickly joined by their southern neighbours, the Trinovantes. The British disaster, as Suetonius called it, had begun. The revolt occurred at a particularly bad time for the Romans, because the governor of Britannia at the time, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was away in northern Wales, culling an island of Druids, and could not quickly return. Before long, the Iceni and their allies were marching south to the Roman military colonia of Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester. This town served as one of the main symbols of Roman domination in Britain, and a constant sting to the pride of the Celtic warrior. Presently it was almost entirely undefended, for its garrison, the 20th Legion, had gone west with Paulinus. To make matters worse, while Camulodunum was full of Roman administrative and cultural buildings, it had little in the way of military fortifications, without so much as walls to hide behind. When the hated Colonia received word of the incoming storm, they pleaded with the Procurator in Londinium, Catus Decianus, for help. Rather than marching to the aid of his countrymen, the Procurator sent them a meagre 200-strong force of poorly equipped slaves. It is entirely possible that Decianus completely underestimated the scale of the revolt. A 2,000-strong segment of the 9th Legion hastily rushed to the rescue of the colony. However, in their haste, they were ambushed by Boudica's Iceni forces and almost totally destroyed. Without any substantial relief arriving in time, the Britons bore down on the city. Men, women and children were wiped out by hanging, crucifixion, burning and other cruel means, while the colony's buildings were burned to the ground. Survivors of this first wave fled to the great temple of Claudius for protection, and were shielded for 2 whole days by the veteran Romans and the small number of reinforcements sent to the town. Despite their resistance, the Celtic numbers paid off, and they burst into the temple, killing everyone they saw. The destruction of Camulodunum was so total that archaeologists are able to see a noticeable layer of scorched debris left by the sacking of the city, called the Boudiccan Destruction Horizon. In the aftermath, a messenger reached Paulinus in Wales, informing him of the disaster and prompting him to force march his troops back to the east, while he rode swiftly with a group of horsemen to appraise the situation. Londinium was the rebels' next major target. This Roman city, founded just after the conquests of 43 AD, had, in the decades since Claudius's initial invasion, grown into a bustling trade centre, populated by merchants, travellers, Roman functionaries and their families. Before Boudicca's horde of Brittonic warriors could arrive in Londinium, Paulinus arrived with his small mounted contingent, and contemplated making a stand to save the town. However, he quickly realized that without his legions, it was a foolish fight to get into. He instead decided to abandon Londinium to its fate in order to buy time for his armies to concentrate, and retreated northwest along the road which would become known as Watling Street. Soon after Paulinus's retreat, the same devastation which had scoured Camulodunum now hit Londinium. The death and destruction was absolute. After slaughtering the population of Londinium, Boudicca set off in the direction of Verulamium, moving north up Watling Street before doing what she had done to the 2 other larger cities. The lack of coins in the archaeological record, however, could imply that the inhabitants realized what was coming and managed to escape with much of their portable wealth, possibly following Paulinus north. Nevertheless, Verulamium also ended up a blackened wasteland. Meanwhile, Paulinus had united with the forces he could muster and picked a spot for the coming decisive battle about halfway up Watling Street, attempting to draw Boudicca as far west as possible to allow time for the legionaries to rest. The field on which the climactic battle would be fought was a spot surrounded by wooden slopes with a narrow entrance, and protected in the rear by a primitive forest dense with undergrowth. In the traditional Roman tactic of using terrain to his advantage, Paulinus knew that in this position, the Romans could not easily be assailed from the flanks or rear. Where exactly in Middle England the battle took place is still a matter of debate, and many locations have been put forward, including the town of Manchester, but it could have been any number of places. Wherever the eventual conflict took place, Paulinus had around 11,000 soldiers at his disposal, consisting of roughly 7,000 highly disciplined legionary heavy infantry, drawn from Legio XIV Gemina and a vexillatio, or a temporarily detached segment of Legio XX. The 4,000 additional troops were 6 cohorts of auxiliar infantry and 2 alli of cavalry, including the consistently fearsome Batavians from the Rhine region. Paulinus had attempted to reinforce his numbers by calling Legio II Augusta from the south, but its commander ignored the request. Forming up in front of their defensive position was, according to Cassius Dio, a horde of 230,000 Celtic screamers. These numbers are highly questionable, but even if we divide the supposed Celtic horde by 5, the Romans were still outnumbered about 5 to 1. The majority of the rebel infantry was armed in the traditional manner of the Latin Celtic warrior, girded with a combination of long slashing swords, shields, and short thrusting spears. As for armour, it was very rare, and Celtic warriors probably went into the fray dressed only in a pair of loose woolen trousers. They instead relied on their fearsome physique and individual skill in fighting to gain victory. Celtic aristocrats and military elites also formed a small force of open-fronted, lightning-fast and nimble chariots. As the rebel force approached Paulinus's ragtag, half-strength contingent, he arrayed his forces along a narrow defile, with his legionnaires serving as the core strength of his army in the centre, 3 auxiliary cohorts on each of their flanks, and an alley of cavalry on each wing, anchored by the forests. The dense forest cover at the sides and behind also meant that retreat would be impossible if the Romans were defeated. It was to be an all-or-nothing battle. As the opposing forces readied themselves for the fray, both commanders attempted to motivate their men. Riding the royal chariot along with her 2 daughters, the queen is reported, by the probably inventful Cassius Dio, to have driven through her loose ranks, shouting to the warriors around her,
"I am descended from mighty men, but I am not fighting for my kingdom and wealth now. I am fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body, and my outraged daughters. Consider how many of you are fighting and why. Then you will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, will do. Let the men live in slavery if they wish."
The comments made on the other side of the battlefield were far more brisk and businesslike, brushing off the apparent riffraff opposite them. "Ignore the racket made by these savages," Paulinus orated to the troops. "They are not soldiers, they are not even properly equipped. We have beaten them before, and when they see our weapons and feel our spirit, they will crack." With a clamorous din of war cries from both sides, the British charioteers opened the battle, wheeling up and down the Roman line, throwing insults and deadly javelins at the Romans in equal measure. The Romans managed to resist this missile onslaught, and before long, the charioteers retreated as the warbands surged forward. They came in a gargantuan head-on assault, hoping to use the shock factor of their charge to crash through and break apart the Roman line. However, the Romans' clever use of terrain now came into effect. As the numerically dominant Celtic horde charged up the slope, it was naturally funneled into an increasingly narrow defile, which acted as a force multiplier, limiting the number of warriors which could engage the Romans at any one time and blunting their charge due to its uphill nature. Nevertheless, the screaming warriors charged forward, and just before they hit the Roman line, were showered by a storm of legionary pila javelins, which would have caused crippling casualties in lightly armed troops. Then, the Roman formation charged downhill in a series of offensive wedge formations, aiming to carve deep swathes into the enemy mass. The legionaries smashed their enemy in the face with the metal center of their heavy scutum shield, and then thrust with the gladius. With the impetus of their initial shock charge blunted by the terrain, plus the sophisticated tactics and brutal efficiency of the enemy, the battle turned. Boudicca's light infantry, who probably had little experience fighting the kind of heavily armoured and armed troops Rome fielded, were progressively, slowly but certainly carved into during the course of the day. British vigour and ferocity were pushed back by Roman endurance and discipline, closer and closer to the semicircle of wagons behind them. Catastrophically, women, children, and the infirm had accompanied the men to this battle. However, the wagons inadvertently served as a large net through which the Celts could not escape quickly enough, and they were massacred. Despite fighting for their own lives and those of their loved ones, the Romans had no mercy. The women, children, and even draft animals were slain by the Roman gladius. We do not know how many perished, but 80,000 Britons were said to have died on the battlefield, at the meagre cost of 400 Romans. Though Boudicca managed to escape on her chariot, Tacitus tells us that she took her own life a few days later, while Cassius Dio says that illness claimed her. Poenius Postumus, the Legio II commander who had refused to assist Paulinus, committed suicide when he heard news of the victory, clearly aware of the fate that awaited him for his insubordination. The legion itself was disgraced, and remained too Augusta for the rest of its days. Conversely, Legio XIV Gemina gained the titles Martia Victrix, martial and victorious, while Legio XX gained the title Valeria Victrix, valiant and victorious. The rest of the Iceni and Trinovantes were utterly annihilated by the punitive Paulinus. After this defeat, Britannia would increasingly be solidified as a Roman province. Sporadic warfare continued for another 20 years, but by 80 AD, Britain had been subdued. Or had it? Over centuries of imperial occupation, formerly Celtic territories like Hispania and Gallia Transalpina had all become core domains of the Roman Empire. Roads, aqueducts, and grand cities increasingly connected these outlying territories to the Italian heartland. The Gallic language survived among the peasantry for a time, but the local nobles, subjected to centuries of Latin education, had become thoroughly Romanized in every meaningful way. Britain was different. As the empire's furthest frontier territory, the Brythonic Celts never embraced the Roman identity as much as their cousins on the continent had. Of course, some did. The southern and eastern edges saw substantial infrastructure spending that led to the development of Roman roads, villas, and cities like Londinium and Eboracum. The local elites here soon got with the program, embracing the Latin language as well as the trappings of Roman material culture. But this civilization existed on a gradient. If a man left the paved streets of Londinium and travelled north or west, the landscape would change. He would begin to see fewer castras and villas, and more wattle roundhouses in the environs of Iron Age hill forts. The regions of what is now most of northern England and Wales had been where anti-Roman resistance had been strongest, and though the natives here had no doubt been conquered, they never truly embraced the Roman way of life like their southeastern kinsmen had. It was here that classical Celtic staples like Latin artwork and the tribal lifestyle survived. For nearly the entirety of imperial rule, these regions had to be kept under strict military occupation. But for all their independent spirit, these were not the last free Celts. If one headed further north, they would find themselves standing before a massive whitewashed wall that stretched from horizon to horizon. A massive structure which, at least in Roman eyes, marked the border where civilization ended and untamed savagery began. Since the Iron Age, the northern half of the island of Britain, corresponding to modern Scotland and the northern extremity of modern England, had been home to many tribes. Perhaps the most powerful of these were the Caledoni, who lived in the highlands of modern Scotland. Their name was a Proto-Celtic portmanteau, meaning those with hard feet, probably a reference to the rugged territory they inhabited. In later centuries, the Romans called them Picti, Latin for painted ones. In these wild northern hills, amidst torrential rivers and rolling plains on the edge of the world, lay the final frontier of Celtic independence. The roots of Rome's first campaigns into the northern half of Britain are in 69 AD. After a year of civil war, one man had eliminated all of his rivals and claimed sole dominion of the imperial purple. That man was none other than Vespasian, the general who in his youth had been the hammer that broke the Britons at the Battle of the Medway. Vespasian's days of campaigning on the edge of the world were over, but his ambitions to fully tame perfidious Albion were not. In 71 AD, he appointed one of his most trusted supporters, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, to command Legio XX Valeria Vitrix, and bring order to the defiant Brigantes, who had thrown off their pro-Roman queen Cartimandua, and launched an open revolt against imperial overlordship. Evidently, Agricola was successful, because 6 years later, in 77 AD, Vespasian made him the governor of the entire province, and equipped him with 4 legions to govern it. At this time, Britannia was one of the most heavily garrisoned parts of the Roman Empire, and for good reason. At 37 years old, Agricola inherited a province which was barely tamed. Boudicca's rebellion was still in recent living memory, and even now there were sparks of insurrection in Wales and northwestern England, which had yet to be put out. Agricola's goals for his tenure as governor were simple: enforce Romanitas upon the conquered tribes of Britain, and expand the frontiers of the empire to the hitherto unconquered tribes of the unexplored northern half of the island. Before we launch into Governor Agricola's epic face-off against the Howling Scots, we must first be responsible historians and discuss the primary source which chronicles his invasion. Almost everything we know about Agricola's campaigns against the Caledonians comes from a biography fittingly known as the Agricola, written by the Roman historian Tacitus, who happened to be Agricola's son-in-law. So not only are we dealing with our usual issue of viewing ancient Celtic history through an exclusively Roman lens, but we are also contending with the fact that our main primary source was written by a man with a nepotistic interest in glorifying his main character. As such, many modern historians are very critical of Tacitus. However, it's not really in our wheelhouse to put a 2,000-year-old proto-ethnographer on trial, so we will simply depict his interpretation of events as is. When Agricola was a little boy, his mother always told him, "Son, no Scotland for you until you finish your Wales." Taking that wisdom to heart, he spent the campaigning season of 78 AD grinding down the stubbornly defiant Ordovices. Making use of the mobile and amphibious Batavian auxiliaries who had previously played a critical role in the initial conquest of Britain, Agricola crushed the Ordovices in battle. Continuing where Gaius Suetonius' Kentucky Fried Druid Paulinus had left off 2 decades earlier, he proceeded to fully subjugate the sacred Isle of Anglesey. That winter, Agricola went on an infrastructure spending spree throughout the territory of the conquered tribes, building temples, courts of justice, and Roman villas for the tribal elites who obediently adopted the Roman way of life. By this time, much of southeastern Britain was well on its way to Romanization, as Celtic nobles, whose mothers and fathers had fought tooth and nail against Roman expansion, developed a liking for the toga, the lounge, the bath, and the elegant banquet. Interestingly enough, Tacitus is somewhat cynical about this, remarking, "All this in their ignorance they called civilization, when it was but a part of their servitude." Despite having a clear admiration of his father-in-law's military victories, Tacitus was critical of the more hedonistic, luxury-loving elements of Roman society, and conveyed a begrudging respect for what he saw as the untamed barbarian, whose life, in his imagination, was brutal yet more honest than the Roman one. Tacitus's fondness for the noble savage trope will become evident in how he depicted the unconquered Caledonians, whose territory his father-in-law was soon to encroach upon. With the south pacified, in the summer campaigning season of 79 AD, Governor Agricola launched his first foray into the unknown and untamed lands beyond imperial control. Tacitus doesn't provide the makeup of his father-in-law's forces, but it is likely they consisted of the 9th and 20th Legions, based out of Carlisle and York respectively, with a contingent of Batavian and Gallic auxiliaries attached. The Roman expedition advanced along 2 prongs, with Legio 20 Valeria Vitrix taking the western route to Galloway and Legio 9 Hispania marching along the eastern coast. Surprisingly, the invaders encountered very little resistance from the locals, with the Navante, Sulgave and Votadini tribes submitting quickly. Tacitus claims that despite the legions being battered by winter storms, the natives were so petrified with fear that they did not dare attack. It is easy to understand why. The threat of the Roman army was not just the invincible image of its heavy infantry, but its monstrous logistical prowess. As Agricola advanced, he oversaw the construction of a network of forts and roads to consolidate his gains, maintain a reliable supply line, and pave the way for future campaigns. Put yourself in the eyes of a lowland Scotsman in this area, and one can understand why many decided it was ill-advised to bear arms against an invader which not only outclassed them in arms and manpower, but was capable of levelling hills and clearing forests within days, and erecting fortresses within the span of single evenings. It is estimated that throughout all his northern campaigns, Agricola had over 35 permanent wooden fortresses built across Scotland. After spending the winter of 79 in their well-provisioned forts, the spring of 80 AD saw Agricola's legions advance into the Firth of Tay and reduce the Venicones tribe to submission, extending his network of roads and castra into their territory. The governor's conquest of Scotland was accomplished very slowly, hill by hill, but by maintaining this glacial pace, he ensured his gains were stable and logistically sustainable. By 81 AD, the Fourth Clyde Isthmus had been fully absorbed into the Roman frontier, with a line of forts running across its southern coast. These forts were regularly re-provisioned by the Roman navy, which now operated along regular supply routes along the coast. That same year, Tacitus mysteriously remarks that Agricola embarked on a ship and defeated peoples unknown to the Romans until then. This may just mean that he crossed to the other side of the Firth of Clyde, but traditionally it has been popularly theorized that the body of water Tacitus mentions Agricola crossing was the Irish Sea. This is supported by the fact that according to Tacitus, at some point a regional Irish king had been exiled from his homeland and crossed the sea, where he came under Agricola's protection. We can imagine the Roman governor entertaining the thought of using this exiled Gaelic chieftain as a pretext to launch an invasion of Ireland. Irish folk legend tantalizingly waters the seeds that Tacitus plants. Tuathal Diechtwa, a legendary Gaelic king, is said to have been exiled to Britain as a boy and to have returned to Ireland at the head of an army to claim the throne. The traditional date of this return is between 76 and 80, and archaeology has found Roman or Romano-British artifacts in several sites associated with Tuathal. Whether or not Agricola dipped his toes into the lands of the Gaels, by 81 AD he had definitely achieved a firm hold over the lowlands of Scotland, making the jagged peaks and valleys of the misty Highlands the only part of Britain whose soil was unmarred by the footprint of the legionaries Caligae. Here the roaring Caledones tribe and their vassals dwelt, and here Agricola would finally come face to face with the Pictish ferocity that future generations of Romans would learn to fear. As the campaigning season of 84 AD commenced, the intrepid governor resumed his northward creep, advancing up along the highland boundary fault, where the gentle hills and steep crags of Alba's two geological zones meet. Ahead of his army, he deployed the Roman fleet up the east coast to spread fear and confusion among the coastal settlements. Yet, unlike their lowland cousins, the woad-streaked Caledonians were uncowed by the advance of the indomitable imperial war machine. Under their leadership, a large confederation began to form, consisting of nearly all the tribes of the highlands, as well as contingents of lowland warriors who were not content to bow down before Agricola as their chieftains had. Deep in the mountains, a massive army gathered to oppose the Roman advance. This army was led by a man named Calgacus, who Tacitus describes as a peerless warrior king, most distinguished in birth and valour among all the Scottish chieftains. Calgacus, whose name means swordsman, is Tacitus's ideal noble savage, a man who would die to preserve a brutalistic but free life, rather than accept servitude amidst the creature comforts of Latin civilization. The climactic clash between Calgacus and Agricola occurred on a hill named Mons Graupius. Modern historians don't know where this hill was located, other than that it could have been anywhere north of the River Tay. Wherever it was there that Calgacus led his massive host, and there he intended to make his stand against the Romans. Agricola's army happened to be encamped nearby, but when the location of the Caledonian army was revealed to Agricola, he double-timed it over, bivouacking his army at the base of the slopes. A stare-down ensued, with the Romans at the bottom of the hill and the Scots at the top. Evidently, Calgacus was quite the charismatic orator, for before the battle commenced, Tacitus attributes to him a stirring speech. To us who dwell upon the uttermost confines of the earth and of freedom, this remote sanctuary of Britain's glory has up to this time been a defence. Now, however, the furthest limits of Britain are thrown open, but there are no tribes beyond us, nothing indeed but waves and rocks, and yet the more terrible Romans, from whose oppression escape is vainly sought by obedience and submission. Robbers of the world, having by their universal plunder exhausted the land, they rifle the deep. If the enemy be rich, they are rapacious. If he be poor, they lust for dominion. Neither the east nor the west has been able to satisfy them. Alone among men they covet with equal eagerness poverty and riches. To robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a solitude and call it peace. Not to be outdone, Agricola turned to face the men who had followed him to the very ends of the earth and delivered a rousing address of his own. Often on the march, when morasses, mountains and rivers were wearing out your strength, did I hear our bravest men exclaim, "When shall we have the enemy before us? When shall we fight? He is now here, driven from his lair, and your wishes and your valor have free scope, and everything favors the conqueror, everything is adverse to the vanquished. Better is an honorable death than a life of shame, and it would be no inglorious death to perish on the extreme confines of earth and of nature." With courageous cheers on both sides, Roman and Scotsmen alike began forming battle lines. The Caledonian Confederacy likely numbered around 30,000 strong. Calgacus organized his massed infantry into two lines, one on the lower slopes of the hill and one in reserve at the peak. On the flat plain at the base of the hill between the two armies, he positioned his charioteers, who ran their paces back and forth along the battle line, hurling their insults and fearless braggadocio toward their enemies. With an army of perhaps 12,000 men total, Agricola was deeply outnumbered. His forces consisted of 3 proper legions, 10 wings of auxiliary cavalry, and 8 cohorts of auxiliary light infantry, who were made up of non-citizens from the Germanic Batavi and Gaulish Tungri tribes. Agricola kept the legions and 4 wings of cavalry in reserve, with their backs to the makeshift camp where they had spent the previous night. On the front line, he positioned his Germanic and Gallic auxiliaries, with his remaining cavalry units supporting them on the flanks. The battle began with both sides hurling their javelins and throwing spears at one another. The Caledones stood indomitable against this withering hail, deflecting the oncoming missiles with their short shields or ducking away. After this opening salvo, Agricola ordered his auxiliaries to advance. The Batavian and Gallic infantry moved forth to engage the Scots, while the governor's frontline cavalry thundered ahead, tying up the opposition's charioteers. The main battle lines clashed with the clamorous din of iron on steel. Although neither side lacked in bravery or ferocity, Tacitus claims it was a discrepancy in equipment which was the deciding factor. In this tightly packed contest, with men pushed up against one another like sardines, the short stabbing swords used by the Batavians and Gauls were far more effective than the long slashing swords used by the Caledones. Slowly, the Roman auxiliaries began gaining ground on their Scottish foes, pushing them up the hill. Soon, the frontline auxiliary cavalry, having chased off the charioteers, joined in the struggle. However, fighting as they were on a slope, the tactical advantage of their mounted mobility was nullified, and they were assimilated into the bloody meat grinder. Seeing their comrades being pushed back, the Britons farther up the hill, who had until then taken no part in the action, now gradually began to move down the slope in an attempt to outflank the advance, wheel around and attack from behind. Agricola, who had anticipated this maneuver, called up the 4 cavalry wings that he had kept back in case of emergency to pull an Uno reverse and outflank this outflanking attempt. So furiously did the reserve cavalry charge against the oncoming opposition that what was intended as a push forward disintegrated into a rout. Fully encircled, the Caledones' lines broke. Carnage was the order of the day, as Mount Graupius was dyed red with the Highlander blood. As for Calgacus, his fate is ultimately unknown. Funnily enough, Agricola had achieved his military magnum opus without losing a single Roman citizen. The legions had no active fighting during the battle, and once again it was the Batavians who provided the hard carry in Rome's prolonged quest for dominance over all of Britain. Modern historians cast a thick shroud of skepticism over pretty much every aspect of the Battle of Mons Graupius, claiming that Calgacus' speech, Calgacus himself, and the battle as a whole are products of Tacitus' overactive imagination, inventions the historian came up with to create a compelling story that glorified his father-in-law. Still, if events did transpire as Tacitus claims they did, then after Mons Graupius, the Roman Empire could truly claim to be the sole master of all of Britain, from its very southern tip to its most northern extremity. However, this mastery would prove to be incredibly fleeting. By 85 AD, Vespasian was dead and Domitian was now cloaked in the imperial purple. The new emperor's relationship with Agricola was noticeably chillier than his predecessor. Tacitus claims that Domitian, whose campaigning in Germany had yielded minor, modest victories at best, was jealous of Agricola's grand military triumphs. This is a little hard to take at face value, since, as previously mentioned, Tacitus is hardly unbiased. Still, for whatever reason, a year after his triumph at Mons Graupius, Gnaeus Julius Agricola was recalled from Britain and never again held a civil or military post. Pretty much immediately after his departure, all his land gains dissolved away like so many grains of sand. Over on the Danube frontier, Rome was engaged in a long and taxing war against Decebalus, the king of Dacia, while also dealing with the emergent threat of the Germanic Marcomanni, Queci and Suebi confederations. To address the dire need for additional manpower on that front, Legio II Adriutix was recalled from Britain back to the continent. With one of its 4 legions gone, a total of 25% of its occupying manpower, the Roman authorities in Britain no longer had the ability to hold on to their gains in the north. By the end of the 1st century AD, all the forts built during Agricola's tenure had been abandoned and destroyed. Over the next few decades, the Caledones and their client tribes increasingly became a persistent thorn in the side of the Romano-British regime, as fierce warbands regularly roved south into occupied territory, plundering the countryside, seizing imported Mediterranean treasures and valuable captives, and dragging them back to their inaccessible highland hill forts. Agricola may have singed their moustaches at Mons Graupius, but by no means had the tribes of the north been tamed. In fact, they had become a force that regularly imperiled Roman security, yet was too remote for the overstretched empire to fully subdue. In 122, Emperor Hadrian, a man whose geopolitical philosophy for the empire revolved around limes or boundaries, brought the situation in the north of Britain to its logical conclusion. A conclusion that even today can be observed by modern hikers exploring the trails of Cumbria and Northumberland. 135 kilometers long and extending from coast to coast, historians have long debated the true reasons behind the monumental feat of engineering that was the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Perhaps its sole purpose was to stymie Pictish raids into Roman territory. Perhaps it also served as an ancient parallel to the Berlin Wall, a barrier which prevented the conquered tribes of Britain from colluding with their unconquered brethren further north. Perhaps it was an 84-mile-long propaganda statement meant to deter the barbarians beyond any funny business through sheer shock and awe. Whatever the case, Hadrian's Wall was a premonition. Although the future Roman emperors would attempt to pick up where Agricola left off, never would the imperial eagle manage to secure any kind of long-term control over the wild and untamed north of Britain. Were not unconquerable, and Rome probably could have brought them to heel with enough time, effort, and blood. However, the far north of Britain was too far away from the imperial heartland to rule effectively. Claudius had been pushing it by conquering southern Britain, large parts of which, as we covered earlier, remained loosely controlled at best. In the case of the Picts, it was better to just build a giant wall to keep them out of the civilized world entirely. That is not to say that future emperors didn't try to conquer the north anyway. For centuries, the painted warriors beyond the wall were a thorn in the empire's side. As it turns out, Hadrian's Wall only slowed them down rather than stopping them entirely. Raids remained a constant problem, and the Picts sometimes aided tribes south of the wall in their constant rebellions. During the reign of Antoninus Pius, the Romans responded to this by invading Pictish territory once more and erecting the Antonine Wall. But this was abandoned a decade later, and the Romans fell back to Hadrian's old frontier. In 210 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus tried his hand at taming the Picts, resulting in a brutal campaign in which his Highland foes played a frustrating game of guerrilla warfare. Here, Roman writer Cassius Dio claims they inflicted 50,000 Roman deaths through attrition alone. Severus later died of illness in Eboracum, and his son Caracalla forged a peace with the natives, forcing the Romans to once more retreat to Hadrian's line. The Picts were not the only Celts of late antiquity to be free of Roman rule. It is now we take a brief detour to Ireland home to a subculture of the Celts known as the Gaels. The Gaels have so far assumed a background role in our video, isolated as they were on their remote island, far away from the concerns of classical Greco-Roman writers. Generally speaking, the Romans showed little interest in the Gaelic homeland, which they called Hibernia. Although when Agricola was invading the Caledonians, he also made preparations to launch an invasion across the Irish Sea, but those probably never materialized. Like northern Britain, Ireland was too remote to be worth conquering. Being a land of wild forests, deadly bogs, and belligerent warlike tribesmen, it wasn't exactly prime real estate anyway. With that said, the island was not entirely isolated from the ancient world. It was a common destination for Brittonic tribes fleeing Roman rule, and the discovery of Roman artifacts in the area has led modern archaeologists to believe that regular trade probably occurred across the Irish Sea. The Gaels could also be quite pestiferous. One of their tribes, the Scotti, were basically sea pirates that regularly raided the western coast of Britain. And yet, despite some trade links and a sprinkle of maritime war crimes, the Irish Gaels would not take centre stage in the history of the Celts until after the departure of the Romans from Britain. After the abandoning of the Antonine Wall, the era of Roman land conquests in Britain had come to an end. From then on, the borders of the imperial province of Britannia would go more or less unchanged until the final departure of the legions in 410 AD. Thus, we will now temporarily move away from our broad narrative of war and geopolitics to take a more intimate look at what daily life looked like for the Celtic Britons living under imperial rule. By 150 AD, large swaths of land in Britain had been reshaped in the ideal of Romanitas. Under imperial auspices, the island achieved a level of urbanization hitherto unheard of. Population centres such as Camulodunum, Aboricum, and of course Londinium offered all of the amenities one could expect from a Roman city. In these bustling entrepôts, townsfolk enjoyed clean water brought in from local aqueducts and advanced sewage systems. Austere temples served the people's spiritual needs, public baths kept them vitalized, while forums and basilicas served as the epicenter of public life. Along gridded streets, the wealthiest of urbanites lived in townhouses decorated with frescoes, mosaics, and courtyard gardens. Beyond city walls, a 3,200-kilometer system of paved roads served as the arteries which joined Britannia's cities to its breadbasket. For aristocratic elites, life in the hinterlands was just as comfortable as in the towns. Throughout the countryside, especially in the domesticated southeast, wealthy landowners lorded over large swaths of fertile farmland in Latin-style villas, which ranged from modest farmsteads to huge palatial estates that transplanted the sun-kissed grandeur of the Mediterranean into the idyllic rolling hills of the English countryside. Many of these villas were equipped with the same comforts and conveniences as urban homes, such as an advanced system of central heating. Like elsewhere in the empire, Roman Britain was no stranger to spectacle. In amphitheatres outside towns across the province, rabid crowds cheered on dueling gladiators, exotic performers, and beast tamers who brought with them ferocious wild animals from the edges of the known world. Indeed, under the rule of the Augusti, Britain was more globally interconnected than ever before. Britain had never been an isolated land, its tribal elites having developed economic and cultural connections across the Atlantic coast long before the arrival of Rome. But it was one thing to be part of an Iron Age exchange network. It was another to be part of a massive tri-continental empire. In the 2nd century AD, a Romano-Celtic aristocrat in Britain shared the same citizenship as a Berber in Mauritania, a Greek in Byzantium, and a Copt in Egypt, and had ease of access to the products of those faraway places. The Roman province of Britannia was a cosmopolitan land, and throughout Roman rule, plenty of civilians and military men from Italy, Asia Minor, Africa, and beyond moved there. However, by and large, the majority of the people who enjoyed her theatres and baths and prayed in her temples were not foreign transplants, but Romanized Celtic natives, the direct descendants of the kings, queens, and tribal elites of the island's indigenous population. Indeed, society in Roman Britain was founded on a strong Celtic bedrock. The Romans had not bulldozed over the human landscape that came before, but co-opted it and built upon it. Many Romano-British civitas were built directly on top of pre-existing tribal hill forts and served as the administrative capital of a native tribe. For example, Isurian Brigantum, near modern-day Aldborough, served as the capital of the Brigantes tribe, while Caliva Atrebatum, on the site of modern-day Silchester, was the capital of the Atrebates tribe. Many of the countryside villas were also owned by Romanized Celtic elites. In fact, Fishborough Palace, the largest and most opulent Roman villa thus far discovered in England, is widely believed to have been originally built for Togidubnus, a king of the British Regni tribe who served as one of Rome's native client rulers. Celtic religion too endured the coming of the Latin overlord. The Romans hated the Druidic order and violently suppressed it due to its practice of human sacrifice and the political influence it wielded. Other than that, the Romans were pretty tolerant of foreign cults. Throughout imperial rule, many local British deities took on new Romanized forms and were equated to similar gods in the Olympian pantheon. The most famous example of this is Sulis, a Celtic life-giving mother goddess worshipped at a sacred thermal spring in Somerset. The Romans equated her with their goddess of wisdom, Minerva, resulting in the Romano-Britons worshipping the hybrid goddess Sulis Minerva, a deity with both Celtic and Latin aspects. The Roman bathhouse built over her sacred springs doubled as a temple for her worship. It is often said that language is the soul of a culture, and if so, then the soul of the Celtic Britons remained alive and well during Roman rule. Of course, Latin achieved a foothold on the island, as it did everywhere else in the empire, but it was adopted only by people who could afford a formal education, and thus did not spread beyond the cities and the social elites. Even then, Romano-British aristocrats were probably bilingual, reserving Latin for use in legal matters, government and business, while speaking Brittonic within intimate family circles. In the countryside, Brittonic remained the only language of the peasantry, for whom Roman rule had little to no cultural impact. Indeed, before the conquest, 90% of Celts had been subsistence farmers. Afterwards, this figure did not change. Under Roman rule, peasants lived in the same tribal villages as their ancestors, speaking the same Celtic languages and cultivating the same crops. To the Iceni cooper or the Brigantian shepherd, it must have made little difference whether they paid a portion of their labours to a torque-wearing chieftain in a hill fort or to a toga-wearing governor in a villa. This was particularly true of the island's relatively untamed western hill country, which was like a time capsule of an era gone by. Here, life continued much the same as it had been before the Roman conquest. People continued to live almost exactly the same way their Iron Age ancestors had, their Celtic religion, language, artwork and oral tradition remaining more or less unchanged from the time before the legions had marched into their lands. The 2nd century AD was the halcyon days of Roman rule in Britain, but over the next 200 years, as the empire came under increasing strain from threats both internal and external, its ability to maintain stable control over its northernmost island province became more and more tenuous. At its maximum territorial extent, the Roman Empire was so big that any further land conquests would put intense strain on the state apparatus. As the empire shifted its geopolitical policy from outward expansion to inward-looking defense, it became increasingly mired with threats, both internal and external. In 235 AD, Emperor Severus Alexander was assassinated, and for the next 50 years, a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, anarchy reigned. The empire collapsed into endemic civil wars as multiple would-be usurpers contended for power, all while plague reaped a bloody harvest throughout the provinces. Germanic tribes from across the Rhine and the Danube migrated en masse into imperial territory, and Rome's most dangerous rival, Sassanid Persia, pounced hungrily upon her enfeebled arch-nemesis like a lioness upon a wounded antelope. In the 260s, internecine turmoil reached its peak, and the empire broke apart, with 2 breakaway states forming: the Palmyrene Empire in the east and the Gallic Empire in the west, of which Britannia was a core territory. Thus, for a brief period, Britain fell out of Rome's control and into the command of a rogue emperor acting in defiance of the central regime. This did not last long. By 274 AD, the Herculean Emperor Aurelian, restorer of the world, defied the odds and glued everything back together. Thereafter, Britannia was embraced back into the bosom of Mother Rome. However, in 286 AD, the province was severed from the Italian heartland again when a Roman naval commander, Carausius, revolted, seized Britain, and declared himself Emperor of the island. This too was short-lived. By 296 AD, Constantinus, the Caesar of the West, had lassoed Britannia back into the imperial fold. Both of these British breakaway states enjoyed only a fleeting existence, but were nevertheless symptoms of an overstrained empire whose hold over Albion was becoming increasingly insecure. Throughout these tumultuous decades, opportunists on the outside looking in took advantage of the uncertain political and military situation, with raiders roving into the province with increasing frequency. From the north, painted Picts and their tribal confederates skirted around a barely garrisoned Hadrian's Wall with ease. From the west came the sea-born Gaelic pirates of the Irish Scotii tribe. From the east, a new threat emerged, a diverse coalition of tribal Germanic peoples from the North Sea coast, who history remembers as the Saxons, a familiar name for anyone even vaguely familiar with the history of early medieval England. For now, though, they were simple fair-weather pirates. In an attempt to mitigate the threat of Saxon corsairs, a chain of fortresses was built along Britannia's eastern coast, headed by a Roman military officer known as the Commis Littoris Saxonici per Britanniam, or Count of the Saxon Shore. Why this line of castles was called the Saxon Shore seems fairly obvious, given who they were built to defend against. However, as likely as it was that these structures were built to fight Saxons, it is very likely that they were manned by Saxons too. By the 4th century AD, the imperial military had been increasingly reliant on foederati, mercenaries recruited from friendly Germanic tribes on the empire's peripheries. The Saxons were not a politically monolithic or even a monocultural people, so it is very likely that while some West Germanic warbands roved the British coastline as vandals and looters, others manned its coastal fortresses as defenders under the imperial payroll. Either way, over the next 2 centuries, Britain became increasingly known to regional Saxon warlords as a place an ambitious man could adventure to seek his fortune, either as a raider or as a paid mercenary. Despite foreign invasions, barbarian migrations, financial woes, and constant civil war putting an immense strain on its military power, the imperial court remained determined to ensure the security of Britannia, which remained one of its more economically productive provinces. In 305, Constantius, now senior emperor of the western provinces, returned to the island he had restored to imperial rule 10 years earlier to campaign against the Picts, whose raids into Romano-British territory were growing increasingly destructive. Constantius scored a crushing victory over the ferocious Celtic woad warriors. However, during the campaign, the Augustus grew suddenly ill and died in York the following summer. Immediately after Constantius's death, the legions in York declared his son, Constantine, as their emperor. Arguably the most capable and successful emperor of late antiquity, Constantine's reign began where his father's ended, on Britannia's foggy shores. Picking up where Pops left off, the young Caesar drove the Picts back beyond the wall, and the Saxon pirates back across the sea. The reign of Constantine, aptly dubbed the Great, represented a renaissance in Roman authority over Britain, and a return to peace and prosperity for the Romano-British citizenry. Moreover, after the enactment of the Edict of Milan in 313, his reign also presided over the rapid popularization of a certain monotheistic religion imported from the sands of the Levantine shore. Unfortunately though, Constantine the Great's tenure proved to be naught but a brief reprieve in the slow decline of Roman rule over Britain. After his death, hardly a generation went by without some manner of attempted usurpation or revolt. As civil war became the de facto method by which imperial succession was determined, Britain became a launch pad for various would-be emperors, who would take the military garrisons on the island to wage war against their political rivals in the imperial heartland, leaving the province vulnerable to barbarian raids. In 350 AD, Constans, the son of Constantine the Great, was overthrown and killed by the usurper Magnus Magnentius, a man who may have been of Celtic Briton descent. Magnentius then drained Britannia of its legions to wage a war against another son of Constantine, Constantius II. Their climactic clash at the Battle of Mursa Major was one of the bloodiest battles in Roman history. Magnentius was eventually defeated, but so great were the losses on both sides that according to the Roman historian Zosimus, Rome was left so vulnerable that it was no longer capable of repelling barbarian incursions. In the case of Britain, he was right. After Magnentius, Roman Britannia was left tantalizingly rich in portable wealth and perilously low on professional soldiers to defend it. Moreover, devastating civil wars aren't necessarily healthy for an empire's financial stability vis-à-vis its ability to pay its troops, so what soldiers did remain in the province were probably not being compensated for their services. All these factors piled up like a mound of dry kindling under the cauldron of disaster, and in 367 AD the match was lit. That fateful year, the skeleton crew garrisoned on Hadrian's Wall, who had been snubbed of one too many paychecks, mutinied and threw open their gates, allowing the marauding Picts to flood into Roman territory en masse. Simultaneously, the Saxons of Germania and the Irish Scotti crashed upon the island's eastern and western shores in full force, easily bypassing the coastal defences which had been built up to keep them out. The Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus called this invasion the Barbarica Conspiratio, or the Great Barbarian Conspiracy. As Britannia was invaded from Ireland, Scotland and northern Germany at the exact same time as the largest garrison of Roman soldiers on the island revolted, it's easy to understand why dismayed Roman observers considered that to be coordination, not coincidence. Southern Britain was completely overrun, and lawlessness was the order of the day. Villas were plundered, cities were sacked, and the Romanized civilian population were subjected to massacres and enslavement. Among the plunderers were not just barbarian raiders, but escaped slaves and deserted Roman soldiers, who were happy to jump on the anarchy bandwagon to enrich themselves with plunder. For the better part of a year, Britannia was basically just the purge. Only in the spring of 368 was one Flavius Theodosius, father of a future emperor Theodosius the Great, able to deploy a relief force to the island. Fortunately for Rome, the barbarian invaders had not come to conquer land, but merely to enrich themselves with slaves, cattle and portable wealth. So by the time Theodosius the Elder made landfall, what had once been a highly coordinated invasion force had devolved into a bunch of small plundering bands, their baggage trains heavy with loot. This made it easy for the Roman reinforcements to mop up the island piecemeal. By the end of the year, the barbarians had been driven back to their homelands, the mutineers had been executed, Hadrian's Wall had been retaken, and order had returned to Britannia. Crisis had been averted, and a province seemingly on the verge of being lost had been restored to Roman control. However, Theodosius's triumph over the barbarian hordes was ultimately just a delaying of the inevitable, for in the decades that followed, the endemic problems contributing to the empire's weakening hold on the island resumed in due course. Born a Spaniard, Magnus Maximus was a Roman military officer who served under Theodosius the Elder during the depurgifying of Britain in 367. In 380 he returned to the Isle to campaign against the Picts and the Irish Scotii, becoming very popular with his troops in the process. You can probably already tell where this is going. In 383 AD, Magnus Maximus became the latest in a line of imperial usurpers to launch his bid for power from Britannia's shores. To raise an army against Gratian, the reigning Western Roman Emperor, the pretender absorbed every fortress garrison in northern and western Britain into his field army. These fortresses were never reoccupied, permanently ending the Roman military presence in what had traditionally been the less developed regions of the British province. The following year, Magnus Maximus defeated Gratian and became Senior Augustus of the Western Empire. To replace the imperial troops he had stripped from the British hinterlands, Emperor Maximus transferred authority in those regions to local Roman-aligned native chieftains, entrusting them to safeguard the Western British Highlands on the Empire's behalf. This effectively gave autonomous home rule to the local Celtic Britons. In traditional folklore, this moment serves as the genesis of medieval Wales. Many of the Brythonic Welsh-speaking kingdoms of the Middle Ages considered their royal dynasties to be directly descended from the native chieftains originally appointed by Magnus Maximus to defend the British frontier from Irish and Pictish raiders. Magnus Maximus occupied an honoured role in the royal genealogies of kingdoms like Gwynedd, Powys, Gwent and Strathclyde, all of whom endured into the High Middle Ages for nearly 1,000 years after Rome's final departure from Albion's shores. In 388, Emperor Maximus's reign came to an ignominious end after a civil war with the Eastern Emperor Theodosius. In the centuries that followed, the security of the Romano-Britons became increasingly imperiled, with Pictish, Irish and Saxon raids renewing in force, ravaging not just the Roman confederated tribal lands of the north and west, but marauding with impunity into the urbanized southeast, which were still under direct imperial administration. Sometime around 396 AD, Stilicho, the de facto generalissimo of a decaying Western Roman Empire, likely launched a naval campaign intended to stymie these seaborne raids. This was a half measure, but it was all that could be done. Stilicho could launch a punitive expedition, but he could spare no troops to permanently garrison the island. His would be the last Roman campaign in Britain of which there is any record. In 401 AD, with the Visigothic king Alaric and the Ostrogothic king Radagaisus bearing down upon the Eternal City itself, Rome was increasingly forced to withdraw yet more soldiers from Britain to protect its imperial heartland. That year, Stilicho stripped the fortresses of the Saxon shore of their military manpower. Additionally, Hadrian's Wall, which had stood as an ardent symbol of Roman dominance over Britain, was depleted of troops for the final time. In the years that followed, the scope of raids on Romano-British territories increased. Niall of the Nine Hostages, a legendary High King of Ireland, was said to have ravaged the southern coast of Britain in 405 AD. The last remaining troops in Roman Britain, a meagre 6,000 or so men, were growing deeply disgruntled. They had been left to defend an island which had been stripped of its defences and all but forgotten by their imperial overlord, and they had not been paid for several years to boot. In 407 they revolted, appointing a military officer named Flavius Claudius Constantinus as their emperor, who led them onto the continent in an attempt to overthrow the reigning emperor Honorius and his commander-in-chief Stilicho. This insurrection was put down by one of Honorius's Gothic foederati. After this, there were no more Roman army personnel remaining in Britain. In 410 AD, Alaric and his Goths became the first foreign army to sack the Eternal City since Brennus and the Senones Gauls did so 800 years earlier. Deep in its death throes, it was all the Western Empire could manage just to stay alive for another few decades. With Germanic invaders now overrunning Gaul, Hispania and Africa, what thought could Rome spare for faraway Britannia? With no other recourse, the province was written off for the last time and left to fate. Thus, Roman rule over the island of Britain had officially and permanently ended, and for the first time in 400 years, all of Albion, for better or worse, was free. The centuries immediately after this departure are known as sub-Roman Britain. As the Romans took with them their habit of thorough record-keeping, this era is largely shrouded in mystery. One thing we know is that even after centuries of Latin occupation, Celtic society was alive and well in Britain, enjoying a better fate than its continental cousins. From Cornwall to the Forth Clyde, the language of Queen Boudica survived as a variety of P-Celtic dialects, broadly classified as Common Brythonic. Meanwhile, the Q-Celtic tongue of Gaelic continued to thrive in Ireland. Finally, in the Scottish Highlands, the Picts howled their war cries with words that distantly related to the tongues to their south. It is also likely that in more urbanized areas, a form of Latin was still in use as one of the many remnants of Britain's recent imperial past. Indeed, many Britons had grown exceedingly accustomed to Roman comforts, and those habits persisted even after Rome's departure. But how Roman was sub-Roman Britain? Robin Fleming, author of Britain After Rome, poignantly describes this post-imperial world to us. In the year 420, there were still people in Britain who had been born in a world shaped by the structure of empire, people whose early lives had been ordered by Rome's material culture. There were those whose childhood dinners had been served on pewter and glass, and middle-aged men who had been raised in heated villas. Britain had once been connected to a continent-spanning empire whose infrastructure brought them the luxuries of Italy, Egypt, and Syria, allowing many Romanized Britons to enjoy an aristocratic station in countryside villas and wealthy cities. But when Rome left, so too did the means to make this way of life possible. Archaeological evidence suggests that in the 5th century, the old world order began rapidly collapsing, as former Roman cities either drastically shrunk in size or became ghost towns, while the majority of the island's villas were abandoned. As Romanitas decayed, older Celtic traditions emerged from its carcass. Some Britons seemed to have moved back into ancient Celtic hill forts, which had stood abandoned for centuries during Roman rule. This massive shift in standard of living probably hit the south and east the hardest. The transition was probably easier for the Britons of the north and the west, who had never been particularly Romanized. It also stands to reason that the Picts and Gaels, who for the most part had always been on the outside looking in, barely experienced any change to their daily lives in this era. However, we should be mindful of the possibility that the Roman lifestyle did not vanish from Britain as quickly as previously thought. The archaeological record suggests that in the 5th century, traders from as far away as Byzantium and North Africa still braved the long journey, most likely due to the island's valuable tin deposits. It is therefore likely that, for a time, some Romano-Britons used this limited foreign trade to maintain a pale imitation of Roman life. Material culture was not the only aspect of Celtic society undergoing a metamorphosis. In centuries past, Roman Britain had been a land of many gods. Native Celtic deities were worshipped alongside Greco-Latin ones, while gods from the furthest edge of the known world established mystery cults in Britain. These included Isis, an Egyptian goddess, and Mithras, an Iranian god, who became popular among Romano-British soldiers. However, by far the most successful religion the Romans introduced to Britain was that of the Levantine carpenter. Christianity arrived on the Isle as early as the 200s AD, and by the time Rome abandoned Britain, had become the dominant religion. While the cross spread rapidly through the British Isles, those who lived there never truly forgot their polytheist roots. Even under the pressure of increasing Christian zealotry, pagan cults probably survived throughout and beyond the 5th century. There may have even been some druidic circles still practicing their occult rites in secluded groves, longing for a return of the old ways. Many Celts also incorporated the rituals of their ancestors into their newly Christian lives. One example of this lies in Ireland, where the spring goddess Brigid was rebranded as the exalted Saint Brigid, patron of Ireland. Her feast day coincides with Imbolc, a pagan festival celebrating the coming of spring. Other pagan rites survived Christianization as well, such as the balefires of Beltane and Samhain, where Brythonic and Gaelic peoples alike would thin the lines between themselves and the other world, known either as Anwin or Tin Anyog, the land where the fairy folk dwelled. In the wake of Roman departure, Britain became a patchwork of petty kingdoms. Remarkably, many of these kingdoms appear to have been formed upon pre-Roman tribal lines, as ancient Iron Age identities re-emerged. Many of these realms are poorly represented in the historical record, but others, such as Powys, Dumnonia, Gwynedd and Strathclyde, are better attested to by virtue of having endured well into the Middle Ages, as opposed to the ones extinguished much earlier on by a certain wave of Germanic migrations. Our main primary source on the wars of this era comes from an early 6th century monk known as Gildas. His work, titled De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, or On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, tells a vivid story of chaos and invasions. De Excidio was not written by a trained historian, but by a devout Christian clergyman writing a religious polemic. Nevertheless, since Gildas's work is by far the most intact source from this era, historians still find themselves reliant on the old monk's writings. His recounting of the 5th century begins with a scene of immediate havoc. No sooner were the Romans gone than the Picts and the Scots, like worms which in the heat of midday came forth, inspired with the same avidity for blood. At this time, the Picts and Scots were probably still predominantly pagan, which would explain why Gildas speaks of them so scathingly. The monk's story continues when the Romano-Christian Britons, beset upon by the relentless raiding of their savage cousins, sent a plea to the declining Roman Empire. The barbarians drive us to the sea throws us back on the barbarians, thus 2 modes of death await us, we are either slain or drowned. Of course, the Romans, only a few decades away from the final collapse of their empire, could offer no salvation. Gildas tells a visceral tale, but his narrative of a victimized Christian people in the face of pagan barbarity is most likely tilted. The Romano-Britons were probably just as warlike as their Celtic cousins, all too willing to invade their neighbours, regardless of the shared culture, language or faith. With that said, there is some truth to the monk's tale. The Gaelic peoples seem to have established colonial realms on the west coast of Britain from the late 4th century onwards. In most of these, they appear to have merged into the culture of the local Brythonic peoples. But in the kingdom of Dalriata, founded by the Scotti warriors of Ulster, they began a slow cultural assimilation of the local Picts. Consequently, the modern nation of Scotland derives its name from the Scotti tribe, and the Scottish Gaelic language still spoken in the country today is a remnant of those Irish roots. However, it would neither be Pict nor Gael that would be the ultimate game changers of sub-Roman Britain. What exactly defines an Anglo-Saxon is a heated historiographic debate, but broadly speaking, they were a diverse amalgamation of tribes from Scandinavian and the North German coastline, primarily consisting of Angles, Saxons and Jutes. They were hardy warriors who spoke North Germanic languages and worshipped a pagan pantheon similar to the one made famous by the Norse Vikings centuries later. Amongst scholarly circles, the whens, hows and whys of the Germanic migrations are topics of intense debate. As we will recall, the presence of Saxons on British shores can be traced back long before the fall of Rome. Seaborne Saxon warbands had been intermittently raiding the eastern coastline of the erstwhile Roman province for centuries, and as imperial control over Britain declined, it had become common practice for Roman officials, or Romano-British, to hire Saxon warriors as paid mercenaries. According to Gildas, the burden of the Saxon tide falls upon the historically dubious Romano-British king named Vortigern. His reign was a tumultuous one. Faced with hordes of marauding Pictish raiders, Vortigern was forced to turn to soldiers of fortune from overseas. Accordingly, help came from the Germanic warriors of the North Sea. Gildas does not elaborate much on the exact identity of these foreign mercenaries, but another early medieval chronicler, the English monk Bede, claims they were led by 2 chieftains of the Jutes, Hengist and Horsa, whose names translate to stallion and horse in Old English. Gildas colours us with his opinion on this hiring. The British king and his councillors were so blinded that as a protection to their country, they sealed its doom by inviting wolves into the sheepfold. The fierce and impious Saxons, a race hateful to both God and men. Tradition has it that in the year 449, the brothers defeated the Picts, then promptly betrayed their Romano-British hosts, conquering a swath of southeastern Britain that would become the Kingdom of Kent. More Germanic migrants would follow in the brothers' wake, and by 500, it seemed as if the western half of England was firmly in Angle, Saxon or Jutish hands. these territories became known to the Celtic Britons as Cloiga, the Lost Lands. It was likely around this time that some Britons who lived on the island's southwest began taking to the seas in flight from the Germanic invaders. They established themselves in the Armorican Peninsula, the first of several waves of settlers to arrive in the region. Thus, the peninsula became known as Brittany, after the Britons who settled it. Anecdotally, a region that had been Celtic-speaking in ancient times, but was then thoroughly Latinized by the Roman Empire, was re-Celticized by British refugees centuries later, and retains its Celtic language and identity to this day. The Saxons had established themselves in Britain, but it appears that for a time, the natives were able to keep them contained by winning a series of military victories, led, if legend is to be believed, by a certain Dux Bellorum named Arthur. Herein lies the great mystery. Was Arthur a real historical figure? If he did exist, it was not amongst the knights, wizards and castles of the high medieval era, but the spears and hill forts of sub-Roman Britain. The name first appears in a 6th century compendium of Welsh poems known as the Gothardin. Here, a Briton hero named Gwarador was described as not Arthur amongst equals in might of feats. This line implies that Arthur was a well-known figure to the 6th century Celts, and was considered the benchmark for heroism in his age. Nennius, a Welsh monk writing in the 9th century, attributed 12 great battles to the semi-mythical warlord, the most triumphant one occurring in the early 500s AD at a place called Mynydd Bathon, generally considered to be modern-day Bath. Leading warriors from across the Brythonic kingdoms, the warlord of legend vanquished an army led by King Aella of the South Saxons, thereby breaking Germanic power in Britain and delaying their advance for an entire generation. With that said, Nennius's accounts should be taken with a mountain of salt, as there's very little evidence that anyone named Arthur fought in any of the battles mentioned. Gildas, writing far closer to the time period in question, attributes Britain victory at Mynydd Bathon not to Arthur but to a Romanized commander named Ambrosius Aurelianus. With that said, when myth and folklore is stripped away, it does seem that, with or without Arthur's help, the Britons were able to fend off the Anglo-Saxons, albeit only temporarily. Within a few decades of Mynydd Bathon, the Anglo-Saxons had evidently recovered, with powerful kingdoms established deep in Cloiga, straddling the borders of unconquered Celtic lands. The Angles and Saxons who lived in these kingdoms were no longer transient invaders, but had lived in Britain for generations, working the same land their fathers and grandfathers had. In short, they were there to stay. Thus, in the second half of the 6th century, the forebears of the English began to push westwards once more, marching boldly into the lands of the men they called Wales, foreigners. In 577 AD, one King Ceolin of the nascent Kingdom of Wessex met 3 British kings, Conmail, Condidan and Farinmail, in a battle at Hinton Hill, near the modern township of Durham. The Saxons routed the Celtic warriors, and as a result, Ceolin was able to expand his territories right into the Severn estuary, severing the land connection between the Britons of Cornwall and Wales. This invariably led to a cultural drift between the newly separated Celtic territories, resulting in the common Brythonic spoken in those regions evolving into the separate languages of Cornish and Welsh. A few decades after the triumph of Saxon Wessex, the Angles of the north began a campaign of their own. King Ethelthryth of Bernicia carved a bloody path of conquest deep into northern Brythonic kingdoms like Reged, Elmet and Gothardin, and crushed the Gaelic king Adain mac Gabrain at the Battle of Dexystan in 603 AD, establishing the Angles as the most dominant people north of the Humber. It must be noted that, in the land conquered by Germanic peoples, native Celtic culture was likely not entirely wiped away. The names of English kingdoms like Bernicia and Kent have Celtic origins, and some Briton blood likely ran through the veins of their earliest kings. The remains of brooch jewellery found in early Saxon graves have shown that the early Germanic settlers borrowed from the artistic traditions of the Britons. As for the Britons themselves, Those who lived in the Cloiga were slowly assimilated into Anglo-Saxon culture over many generations. The line between Saxon and Celt was often more blurred than we think. Nevertheless, a frontier still existed between communities who spoke Old English and communities who spoke Brythonic and Gaelic. By the dawn of the 7th century, this frontier had become more or less entrenched, and would not move in any dramatic way for centuries. Be it by Roman or Germanic invaders, the Celts had lost much over the last 1,000 years or so. One can only wonder if a Welsh bowman in the 6th century AD, looking across a dike at a line of Saxon spears, would have been remotely aware of the fact that his ancestors' culture had once spread across an entire continent, a culture that was now confined to the westernmost edge of Britain. The days when Gallic hordes marched into the heart of Greece or duelled Roman legions from Spain to Turkey were long gone. But as territorially diminished as the Celts were, they would not go quietly into the night. As late antiquity transitioned into the Middle Ages, the stage was set for Europe's most enigmatic people to make their mark upon the medieval world. In the east, the ancestral home of the Brythonic peoples had fallen to Saxon invaders, but in the west, the heirs of Arthur would defy the rule of the nascent English people for centuries yet. Thus the history of medieval Wales and her sister states in Cornwall, Brittany and Erhenoglaith began. Meanwhile, with howling Picts and Northumbrians on their doorstep, the Gaels of Dalriata would write their own saga of blood and battle, eventually giving rise to the Kingdom of Scotland. Finally, across the narrow sea, Ireland would remain a relatively isolated land of internecine chieftains. But in time, the outside world would come knocking on their door in the form of Vikings, Normans, and beyond. Indeed, the story of the Celts was not yet over, and in our current series on the medieval Celts, we talk about the history of medieval Wales. To check out those videos and more, make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel.